Fear doesn't strike like lightning. It seeps like fog through the pines, unnoticed until it presses cold against your skin and you realize you've been breathing it in all along. I learned that the hard way. My name doesn't matter. Not really. Out in the forest, names become small things, insignificant. People remember your footprints, your mistakes, the way your flashlight cuts through branches that look like reaching fingers. But names, they get buried under pine needles and forgotten by the wind. What matters is the job. I'm a forest ranger. Ask anyone who's never done the work and they'll tell you it's peaceful, a dream life. Sunsets and quiet trails, the fresh scent of morning dew, a cabin with a porch that faces the mountains. They picture something like an outdoor retirement plan, a postcard existence. Those are the people who only visit the woods during the day. Where I work, up near the deep northern borders where the land stops feeling like America and starts feeling like something ancient, the nights are a different country. No street lamps, no late-night diners, just darkness layered on thicker darkness, with creatures that learned to hunt long before humans learned to fear. Around here, folks speak about the forest like an unpredictable neighbor, mostly quiet, but capable of violence. They say the pines remember everything, and they whisper about things that walk upright but aren't human anymore. I didn't believe any of that when I arrived. I was 29 then, proud, strong, fresh out of academy training and convinced I could take on anything nature threw at me. A couple of black bears? Please. A pack of coyotes? I'd read the handbook. How hard could it be? I'd hiked all across the Rockies and camped through storms that left tents in tatters. Fear had never been part of my vocabulary. But truth has sharp edges, and arrogance blinds you to the cuts. It was my first posting, deep inside a national forest with a name from old tribal legends that translates loosely to the land that watches, a patch of wilderness so vast and unmapped that even satellite images struggle to find clearings. Our district office sat near the only real road cutting through the area, one lane, cracked asphalt, potholes growing moss like they were trying to return to Earth. My cabin was another 5 miles downhill from that, tucked among red-barked pines that creaked even without wind. On my first day, the older rangers sized me up with a caution I didn't understand. They weren't unfriendly, just tired in a way that looked bone deep, like they carried a truth they didn't want anymore. The chief, an older man named Sawyer with hands like roots and eyes that saw through lies, gave me the rundown. Maps rolled across desks. Radio frequencies scribbled into notebooks. The location of animal dens, weather hazards, specific campsites where hikers had vanished over the years. He said the statistics like they were trivial. People disappear everywhere. The forests are not Disneyland. But there was something in the way he spoke, an invisible weight pressing down on each word. When I tried to laugh off the danger, the other rangers didn't join me. Later that night at the tavern, one of them, a local named Hart with a permanent frown etched into his jawline, pulled up a stool next to mine. He stared into his glass before speaking, voice low enough that only I could hear. "You'll do fine if you remember one thing," he murmured. "There's no shame in running when the forest goes quiet." I chuckled like an idiot. "Bears?" He didn't look up. "The bears make noise." I waited for him to continue. He didn't. That was the first seed of unease planted in my mind. I brushed it off then. I shouldn't have. After a week, the forest began revealing small truths. Trails that shifted, wildlife behaving strangely, deer that refused to go near certain groves, birds that evacuated whole sections of woods without warning. I logged the oddities, filed the reports, did everything protocol demanded. Then came the night that broke my confidence. It was near the end of September. The air was cold enough that every breath stung a little. Stars scattered bright above the pines like they were trying to guide lost souls home. I had just finished checking a campsite where a couple had reported strange noises, scraping metal, branches snapping, something large circling their tent at night. Probably a black bear. That's what I told them. That's what I believed. I was hiking back alone, boots crunching over frosted leaves when the forest exhaled, except that's the wrong word. It was too deliberate, too directional. The wind didn't move with it. Not a single branch shifted, but I felt it slide across my neck like warm breath. Instinct kicked in before logic. I turned slowly, flashlight rising. There was nothing behind me, no animal, no falling branch, just endless pine columns stretching tight and silent like prison bars. I stood there listening, waiting for my heartbeat to calm. It didn't. Something was off. An absence of life so complete it made my skin prickle. No crickets, no owls, even the rustling of leaves had vanished. The entire forest held its breath. Hart's warning echoed in my memory. There's no shame in running when the forest goes quiet. But fear likes to mask itself as pride. So I kept walking. Big mistake. About 50 yards ahead, the trail dipped into a shallow hollow where fog pooled around my knees. I pushed through, my beam slicing thin streaks of white vapor. Then I saw it. A print. In the mud. Huge. Human-shaped, but wrong. Twice the length of my boot. Toes longer than fingers. The weight pressing so deep into the earth, the edges looked like melted candle wax. And it wasn't alone. A trail of them led out of the fog and into the timberline, spaced too far apart for any human stride. All my training, survival instincts, animal tracking knowledge, none of it gave me an explanation I could believe. I crouched for a closer look. The air around the tracks felt warmer, almost humid, like something had just stood there seconds earlier. My light flickered, catching on the texture inside the print grooves. Tiny strands of pine bark crushed and twisted, as though whatever made the track had gripped the ground instead of stepped on it. Something about that detail made my stomach twist. I lifted my radio. Static answered, thick, muffled, like the signal was being swallowed by the night itself. That was when the smell hit, musky, sour, and ancient. The scent of wet fur mixed with rot and something metallic beneath it. My vision tunneled. My heartbeat stuttered. Then I heard it. A low, rumbling breath that vibrated the ground. Not from the direction of the prints, but behind me. I didn't turn. I couldn't. My muscles froze, every nerve firing warning signals. The breath grew louder, closer, hot enough that the back of my neck dampened with sweat. For the first time in my life, I understood the true meaning of prey. And that was when a different instinct overpowered fear. Move. I ran, full sprint, flashlight jerking violently, radio bouncing uselessly against my chest. Branches tore at my jacket as I crashed through brush and slid back onto the main path. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see whatever shadow followed. The quiet forest erupted behind me, thundering footfalls, snapping timber, something massive crashing through the pines. I sprinted until the light from the ranger station pierced the dark like a sanctuary. My boots skidded over gravel as I stumbled up the steps, slammed into the door, and locked it behind me. Breath ripping out of me, I stood in silence. The footsteps stopped right at the edge of the tree line. Too close. Too curious. I dared a glance out the window. The pines swayed, just slightly, as if something large brushed against them. I saw no face, no form. But in the space between the trunks, I caught a glint of reflected moonlight. Eyes, higher than mine. Watching. I didn't sleep that night. I told the chief the next morning. He stared at me a long time before asking a simple question. Did you see it clearly? When I said no, he nodded, as if that answer pleased him more than the truth ever could. But Hart found me later, pale and serious, and asked something different. Did it follow you home? I didn't know how to answer. The silence that followed felt like a verdict. And from that moment on, I understood that I had stepped into a story locals still whisper for a reason. Because in this forest, fear isn't a warning, it's a promise. Every ranger learns that survival depends on routine. When fear rattles the bones, structure keeps you sane. Wake up, check the radio, inspect the perimeter, drink terrible coffee, pretend nothing monstrous stalks the tree line. Act like the forest is still just trees. But once you've been chased by something you can't explain, your routines start to feel like thin armor, an illusion of safety. For a while, nothing happened. Days were quiet. A coyote sighting here, a fallen tree blocking a service road there. I tried telling myself I'd exaggerated everything. Darkness plays tricks. Fear makes anything feel bigger than it is. Maybe I'd been running from a curious bear in a bad patch of fog. Denial is a gentle liar. But then the knocking started. It was around 2 a.m. when I first heard it. 3 soft thuds against the wooden siding of my cabin. Deliberate, paused, repeated. Not frantic like an animal, not random like falling branches. 3 knocks. Silence. 3 more. I rolled out of bed and grabbed my flashlight, creeping toward the window. My breath fogged the glass. Outside, only the porch light swung on its wire, casting dizzy shadows that stretched like limbs across the dirt. Probably pine cones, I whispered to myself, even though that explanation was stupid and I knew it. The knocking stopped for that night. But the next night, it came again. Same rhythm, same patience. By the 3rd night, the knocks had moved to the back wall near my bedroom window. On the 4th night, they were at the door. I don't scare easily, at least I didn't used to. But fear has a way of deepening with repetition, burrowing into the mind like roots searching for water. The knocks became the pulse of my anxiety. I'd lie awake waiting for them, muscles tense, breath shallow, and each night they grew louder. One evening I snapped, ripped the door open, and shouted into the darkness, light shaking in my hand. "Enough! Who's out here?" Nothing answered except the wind, but even the wind felt wrong, like it was holding its voice, listening. I told the chief again. He frowned but didn't dismiss me. "There are stories," he admitted. "Old stories. But we keep this place grounded in what's real. Report everything. No speculation." He handed me a folder labeled Unresolved Incidents. Inside were brief reports from previous rangers. Scratching, knocking, distant calls, giant tracks, missing livestock. Nothing official, nothing that risked careers, but enough to rewrite my reality. I asked him why none of this was in our training manuals. "Because fear is contagious," he said, "and we can't afford an outbreak." His answer made me angry and afraid in equal measure. What right did they have to hide the truth from those risking their lives out there? What were we walking into blindfolded? But when I asked if anyone had ever seen the creature responsible, his reply was unsettlingly sharp. If they had, they didn't come back to talk about it. There was no courage in that moment, only a hollow feeling, like my bravado was draining through cracks I didn't know I had. The second story came a few weeks later. We received a call about a lost hiker, an older man who'd been camping near the ridge trails with his grandson. The boy returned alone, silent, shivering, unable to explain what happened except a terrified whisper. It took him. The kid stared past us the entire time, eyes fixed on the tree line like something was waiting for him to look away. His hands trembled uncontrollably, fingers curled tight as if still gripping someone who'd slipped free. We launched a search immediately, 8 rangers sweeping the area with dogs. The forest resisted us that day. Fog swallowed the ridge, smothering sight and sound. Radios crackled with static broken only by fragments of wailing wind. After 6 hours, we found the grandfather's boot, then the other. Both standing upright, toes buried in the dirt, heel prints missing like his feet had been pulled straight out of them. The trail continued on bare ground until it didn't, until the tracks lifted upward against a tree trunk, then vanished into the branches. We stood there frozen, minds wrestling with reason. Bears climb, mountain lions climb, but neither plucks a man out of his boots before ascending. The dogs whined and tucked tails. They refused to proceed. One of them peed itself from fear, that instinctual kind that no training can override. We searched until night forced us back. The official report cited a fall into unknown ravine terrain and likely Widowmaker event. But we never found a ravine. We never found a body. And the boy? He never spoke another word. That night, the knocking on my cabin walls didn't just return. It moved, circling the structure like a predator testing a trap. Knuckles or claws traced the wood grain, slow, listening for weakness. I sat with my back against the front door, shotgun resting across my knees, heart stampeding through my ribs. The fear wasn't just outside anymore. It was inside me, a presence pacing inside my chest. Something else happened too. There was a sound above the knocking, The faintest whisper, rhythmic, almost curious, like someone mimicking speech but missing the shape of the words. A low murmur that sent needles of ice up my spine, and then, closer than anything had ever dared before, a voice. Not human, yet painfully close. It said my name. I hadn't introduced myself by name to anyone but the Rangers. I never used it over the radio. Tourists didn't know it, but it was outside, knowing, wanting. And for the first time since joining the service, I locked every window. Then I waited for morning like a dying man waits for rescue. The worst part wasn't the terror. It was the doubt creeping through the cracks of my sanity. I told myself exhaustion explains whispers, stress explains knocks, imagination explains eyes in the trees. But doubt only deepens when logic fails. The locals didn't help either. They'd look at me with those weary, knowing eyes, and I'd feel my questions curdling in my throat. In town, old-timers told cautionary tales around bar counters, legends spoken without flourish, how something old lives in those woods, how it hates when strangers ignore the rules, how the pines protect their spirit by taking pieces of others. No one used the word Yeti, though some muttered about tall ones, or forest keepers, or the mimicker, as though language itself feared naming it wrong. Every story ended the same way, and the forest always wins. It wasn't superstition, not stories told with smirks. These were confessions, and like every confession, they carried the weight of truth. I wish I could say the fear made me a smarter ranger, that I learned something, that courage was forged in those sleepless nights. But what happened next showed me that fear wasn't done teaching. It had only begun. One brittle morning, frost still clinging to the cabin roof, the chief appeared on my porch with a folded note. The handwriting was frantic, letters jagged and smeared. My stomach twisted as he handed it to me. It was from Hart, the ranger who warned me about the quiet. I can't stay here. It knows my face. It's getting closer. His keys were left on his desk, uniform neatly folded. Radio smashed. Hart didn't report for duty again. He didn't come back for his truck. He didn't go home. We never found anything but the echo of his fear. And I realized then, with a terror that tore through my bones, no one leaves this forest unmarked. Its spirits claim something, a mind, a body, a name, and now it had mine. I tried to pretend the forest had simply claimed another lost soul. We lose rangers, we lose hikers, we lose pieces of ourselves out here. The wilderness takes what it wants. That's the unspoken pact. We protect it, but it never promises the same in return. But what happened with Hart wasn't a simple disappearance. His fear lingered like a scent, clinging to his empty bunk, to his abandoned boots, to the static in the radio channels he once monitored. Fear leaves a residue. Once you've seen someone break, every shadow looks like a warning. After Hart vanished, the chief rotated our patrol areas. He paired me with a ranger named Ellis, quiet, steady hands, a man who believed rules could keep death contained. I wanted to believe that too. Our shift mostly involved trail checks, abandoned camp cleanups, and the endless counting of footprints, human and otherwise. But the unease followed. It always does, when your enemy is silence. One afternoon, we received another call. A camper had reported screams near the Basin Trail the previous night, long, low, guttural screams that echoed like something dying slowly but refusing to give up, the kind of screams that make prey run blindly and predators listen carefully. We hiked out with gear and radios, dogs pulling hard at the leash, too eager or too afraid. I couldn't tell which. The basin was a scar in the earth, dense timber on all sides, a single natural clearing carved by ancient storms. The moment we stepped into that open space, the dogs stopped. Completely. Their bodies went rigid, tails lowered, ears pinned flat. Ellis knelt, whispering to calm them, but their trembling only worsened. And then we found the campsite. It looked normal enough at first, a tent, a fire ring, a backpack propped against a stump. But the tent flap was torn like it had been ripped from the inside. Not slashed, shredded. Fabric hung in wet strips, stained with something dark that had dried in stiff, jagged patterns. Blood. Too much blood. The firewood was scattered. The campsite was a burst of violence frozen in place. The The scent of copper and cold air wrapped thick around us. Ellis called out. No reply. We circled the clearing, searching for tracks for any direction the camper might have run, but the ground was wrong. The dirt was disturbed, yes, but not by feet. It looked like something had dragged across it on all fours and sometimes on two. I knelt lower, heart rattling, and brushed aside a patch of leaves. More prints. Not boots, not hooves. Those same monstrous, elongated toes I'd seen weeks earlier, pressing impossibly deep into the soil. Each stride too long, too deliberate. And they circled the tent over and over again, stalking. Choosing a moment. A sick dread tightened inside my ribs. The air tasted heavier, iron and earth, and something hot beneath it, like a furnace breathing underground. Radio the chief, I said. But just as Ellis raised the transmitter, the forest went silent. Again. That same suffocating silence that stole every natural sound. The dogs whined and tried to bolt, leashes straining. Ellis froze, eyes scanning the timberline. I heard it then. Not the scream we came for. Not knocking. Not the mimic of my name. A clicking sound. Sharp. Hollow. Like claws tapping bone. Tap, tap, tap. It moved in a deliberate grid, right to left, then back again. Like mapping the clearing. Like deciding how to enter. I felt watched. Not by one presence, but by the weight of 1,000 years of hunger. The pines seemed to lean closer, as though they were the walls of a narrowing throat. Ellis whispered, "Back away, slow." But fear doesn't always obey orders. My body wanted to run. My mind wanted to collapse. Something primal battled inside me. Freeze versus flee, logic versus instinct. The clicking stopped. A branch cracked behind us. Ellis spun, rifle raised. I pointed my light. 2 eyes glowed from between the trunks, reflective, perfectly still, set too far apart for any deer or bear. They were high, higher than any human could stand without a ladder. The eyes blinked, not horizontally, vertically. My breath left me in a single, painful exhale. Ellis took a single step back and whispered, "Whatever you do, don't look away first." But I already had. The moment fear seized me, my gaze fell, cowardice disguised as caution. And in that fraction of a second, the shadows rearranged. The eyes were gone. Silence. Then, the dogs howled as the leash snapped tight. Something massive launched through the clearing, moving faster than instinct could register. We fired blindly. 2 shots swallowed by the trees. The air exploded with motion, wind, and the stench of fur and rot whipping past us. Then it was gone again, like a nightmare that slams you awake before you understand how it hurts. We sprinted. Discipline forgotten. Radio's dead. The dogs dragging us one direction, away, whether or not it led to safety. We didn't stop until the clearing disappeared behind a hill and the cabin roofs glinted through the branches like needles of salvation. Ellis collapsed to his knees, hands shaking uncontrollably. One of the dogs vomited from stress. We never found the camper. Official cause of disappearance, animal predation. Unspoken truth, predators leave bodies. Predators leave tracks that make sense. Predators don't. Strategize. Whatever hunts this forest doesn't rely on instinct. It thinks. It learns. And worst of all, it enjoys the chase. That night, I couldn't stay in my cabin. Every wall felt too thin. Every window felt like exposure. So I slept in the station, light on, shotgun cradled close. Or I tried to sleep. Mostly I sat awake, attempting to stitch reason over a wound that kept tearing wider. I kept remembering the boy's empty stare. Heart's note. The boots left in perfect alignment. The voice that said my name like a smile with teeth. Patterns emerge when you stop lying to yourself. This thing, whatever it was, wasn't random. It was stalking, testing, choosing, and it was patient enough to play the long game. In the early hours before dawn, I opened the unresolved incidents folder again. Maps, coordinates, descriptions of sounds, shapes, glimpses in the night. But one report, buried at the bottom, yellowed and crinkled, caught my eye. A ranger from decades ago, last name Whitaker, he wrote, "Tracks lead into the cave, smell of decay, humans mimic sounds, but these echoes are wrong. The pines don't grow near the entrance. They fear it, as we should. If I don't return, don't let it reach the tree lines. Burn the cave." But there was no follow-up report, no confirmation, no one burned anything, just silence and a cave circled in red ink on the map. deep in the mountains, almost exactly between where Hart disappeared and where the camper was taken. The cave, a mouth in the earth, swallowing lives, spitting out legends. My blood turned cold. This wasn't a territory dispute. It wasn't a creature defending its home. It was a hunter with a den. And I realized the truth that should have terrified me more than anything. It wasn't chasing us because we were trespassing. It was chasing us because we kept getting away. I didn't decide to go looking for the cave. The decision was already made. The forest had been guiding me toward it from the first night I smelled its breath. Some spirits wait to be found. Some demand it. And the pines, they were done whispering. There's a point where fear stops being a warning and becomes a direction. When running no longer feels like survival, but surrender. That's when you start walking toward the thing you fear. Because some threats don't vanish when ignored. They wait, they hunger, they take your hesitation as an invitation. I didn't tell the chief what I had found in Whitaker's report. If I spoke it aloud, it would become real, too real, and someone would try to stop me. Someone would try to make it make sense, and reason was useless out here. Reason had never saved anyone this deep in the woods. I left at dusk. Worst possible decision, best possible timing. I packed Lightio. Radio, flashlight, and extra batteries, rope, sidearm, a flare. I prayed I wouldn't need. And a folded map that already felt like a eulogy for me. The cave was miles north beyond designated trails, a place the forest seemed determined to hide. As I ventured deeper, the ground sloped downward, soil shifting from brown to almost black, compacted like ash. The trees changed too, thicker trunks, branches gnarling into shapes that looked disturbingly like hands shielding their faces. Creatures I usually trusted as trail guides. Ravens, squirrels, even the insects, vanished by the halfway mark. No rustling leaves, no owl calls. The silence wasn't just present, it pursued me. It became a presence walking a step behind. My boots crunched loudly, too loudly, in the absence of all other sound. Every crack beneath my feet felt like an alarm. I imagined it hearing me, measuring me, enjoying the suspense. When the forest finally broke open into a clearing of stone, I felt relief until I saw what created the opening. Nothing grew near the cave. The pines stopped in a perfect ring 20 yards from the entrance. Not a leaf crossed the boundary, as though the earth itself refused to nourish anything touched by the darkness within. I understood then, nature was afraid too. The entrance was taller than a man and shaped like a scream. Jagged rock teeth crowned the opening. Mist seeped outward like breath that had been trapped for centuries. A smell rolled toward me, damp fur and old blood. My flashlight beam trembled across the rocks. Scratches ran along the walls, not from erosion, from claws. Desperate claws. Claws that knew they were being dragged inside. Deep grooves like tally marks. I swallowed the rising bile in my throat and took one step forward, then another, until the light no longer reached the clearing behind me. The darkness smothered everything. Inside, the cave walls dripped condensation that ran down in tiny rivulets, glistening like tears. The floor slanted downward sharply, a throat swallowing me whole. Every sound I made echoed back wrong, slower, distorted, as if something repeated me a second later, but slightly off. I whispered, "Heart, echo, heart, but twisted, like the word had too many bones." I stopped breathing. Something else kept breathing for me, heavy, hot air puffing against the back of my neck. I spun. Nothing, just blackness so complete it felt physical. I fumbled for my radio and whispered, "Ranger Unit 3, do you copy?" Static. Then faint scratching. A long exhale, something dragging across the microphone. My own voice returned through the radio, fragmented, delayed. "Stop loop King." I dropped it. The sound clattered, ricocheting deep into the cave. That's when I heard the moans. Human moans. At least they started that way. A chorus of agony, muffled and layered, echoing from somewhere far beneath. My heart hammered so violently I thought it might shatter my ribs. I pressed one hand to the wall to stabilize myself and felt fabric. Cloth embedded into stone like flesh turned to rock. A torn shirt sleeve, a string of beads tangled in a gouge, a human fingernail buried in the limestone. I stumbled back, horror beating through me like a war drum. The moans transformed, becoming voices, panicked whispers stacking atop one another. Help, don't let it in. I didn't look away. It has his face. Run. Then, above them all, one clear voice. Stop. Stay still. Not terror, not pain. Command. I turned toward the sound before realizing my mistake. Two eyes hovered in the dark, pale and cloudy like marble. Human eyes. The outline of a man emerged. Uniform, gear, familiar stance. Heart. His face was gaunt, hollowed, skin stretched too tight over bone. But it was him. It had to be. He stepped closer, feet scraping stone like he barely remembered how to walk upright. Don't move, he rasped. It sees movement before shape. It hears blood before voice. I stepped toward him despite every instinct screaming, run. Heart, it's me. We're getting out of here, both of us. He blinked slowly, too slowly, like the motion was being imitated rather than triggered. Behind him, the darkness swelled, a shifting mass rising from the cavern floor. Its footsteps sounded just like his. One, then another, then another. Hart's voice suddenly deepened, warped. You came here alone. It wasn't a question. It was hunger given words. His jaw cracked, widening into a grotesque grin. His shoulders stretched at angles no joint should allow. His spine rippled beneath his skin like a creature inside was trying to break out. And then he spoke again, but this time the voice was mine. It said my name. Inside that cave, I learned the real danger was never the creature's teeth or claws. It was the mimicry, the way it stole your familiarity, your trust, your sense of reality. Because the moment you believe the lie, you step closer to your own death. I backed away, slow, controlled, eyes locked on the thing wearing Hart's memory like a mask. Its movements mirrored mine, too perfectly. A delayed reflection, learning in real time how to be me. When my hand tightened on the flare, its fingers curled around the empty air in the exact same way. I struck the flare. The cave threw itself backward, walls pulsing red with sudden fire. The thing screamed, not like a predator, like a man burned alive by sunlight. Dozens of voices howled in unison, voices of the missing, voices of the dead, voices of the hunters and the hunted merging into one nightmarish roar. I ran like the earth was collapsing behind me. Because it was. Footsteps thundered after me, heavy, leaping, closer. The cave's throat constricted, trying to hold me in darkness. Lights spilled ahead the clearing. Salvation. I dove through the mouth of the cave as a massive arm, dark as tree bark and covered in thick matted hair, swiped inches above my head. The flare arced behind me, landing deep inside. And then I saw it. Finally saw it. Half man, half animal. Nothing born of this world. A towering silhouette framed by firelight, eyes like hollow moons, teeth that once belonged to someone human. It roared, not in pain, but in rage. A roar that promised our story wasn't finished. I scrambled toward the tree line, lungs shredding, legs numb, ears ringing with its fury. My last glimpse back at the cave, the flare fizzled, darkness reclaimed everything, and somewhere inside, it laughed. I didn't stop running until the trees felt like they were swallowing me whole again. The forest blurred into streaks of black and silver, moonlight tearing through gaps between branches as if trying to keep me alive with breadcrumbs of light. But behind me, the world was no longer silent. It was tracking me. Twigs snapped in a rhythm. Not frantic, not clumsy, hunting rhythm. Calculated distance, confidence in the kill. Every primal instinct screamed that turning around meant death, so I kept pushing through the dark until my lungs burned and my legs numbed into unfeeling machines. The cold tore into my throat with each breath, but the pain felt distant, overshadowed by the thick, wet sound of something breathing far too close. The ranger station lights finally flickered through the pines. Hope. Then the hope shattered. Because as soon as I saw the safety of that building, the forest fell quiet. Not a good quiet. Not relief. But permission. Like it wanted me to witness what came next with absolute clarity. I stumbled up the stairs and burst through the station door, slamming it shut behind me. My flashlight clattered to the floor as I locked every bolt with trembling fingers. I pressed my back against the wood, breath breaking into shallow, panicked shards. For a minute, maybe less, nothing. No knocking, no scraping, no growl, just the pounding in my head like a warning bell. I slid down to the floor, knees pulled to my chest, shotgun across my lap. Then something gently touched the door from outside. Not a pound, not a slam, a fingertip, sliding down the wood, slow, deliberate, like someone dragging a nail, memorizing the shape of me on the other side. That's when the radio on the desk crackled to life. Static hissed, then resolved into a voice warped through distance and pain. "Don't look out the window." Ellis. He had gone searching for me when I didn't return. He was still out there, vulnerable, and I was hiding behind walls. Coward. I sprang up and ran to the radio, grabbing it with desperation. "Ellis, talk to me. Where are you?" A wet gasp, the sound of fabric tearing, bones shifting. Then his voice again, but shorter, clipped, strangled. "Not me." My veins turned to ice. The radio clicked off. Something enormous moved past the windows, a shadow erasing the stars. I edged toward the blinds, pulse hammering my skull, but I didn't dare open them. Every horror in my body begged me not to. Then came a sound I'll never forget, my own voice speaking from outside. "Let me in." It wasn't mocking. It was perfect. Same cadence, same exhaustion, same fear. "Please," it begged again. "I'm hurt." The doorknob twisted. I nearly fired around through the wood, but something stopped me. A realization. This creature, this nightmare, wasn't trying to break in. It was trying to be invited. The most ancient rule buried in every legend humans ever shared. Evil wears the face of the familiar, and it waits for permission. I backed away slowly until my heel bumped something soft. Ellis's backpack. Inside the station. Covered in mud and pine needles. He never left. My throat tightened. Tears threatened but refused to fall. The radio clicked on again. This time, the voice was calm. My calm. "You can't stay in there forever." The temperature in the room dropped, breath turning visible, frost creeping over the windows like veins of winter. The creature's shadow shifted, growing, changing, testing new shapes. Then, silence, which terrified me more than any noise. Because silence meant it was thinking. Minutes crawled like hours while I stood motionless, shotgun raised, bracing for impact that never came. Eventually, exhaustion suffocated fear, and I collapsed onto the floor, weapons still aimed at the door as my eyelids finally lost their battle. When sunlight touched my face through the blinds the next morning, I jolted awake, heart in my throat, expecting teeth around my neck. But the forest outside looked normal again. Birdsong, wind, life. The night had vanished without a trace, except one. Right in front of the station door, where the dirt was still wet from morning dew, footprints, huge, human-shaped, twice the length of mine, leading away toward the pines and then disappearing into the tree line as if the forest swallowed them on purpose. Ellis never returned. Hart never returned. The missing hiker never returned. The official reports list them as lost due to terrain, likely animal attack, weather-related disorientation. The usual lies we tell the living. But I know the truth. The pines don't just whisper, they warn. And that cave is a wound in the earth that will never stop bleeding. Weeks passed, then months. I kept patrolling, kept pretending, but fear had become a familiar companion, a shadow that lingered just long enough to remind me who was really in control. I began noticing patterns in the reports. Disappearances always clustered around the same moon phases, always near old drainages or cave systems, always where the forest grew too dense for light to win, and the knocking never stopped. Even when I switched cabins, even on nights I slept in town, it was following me now. One night, unable to bear the loneliness, I returned to the tavern. Locals sat hunched over their drinks like secrets weighed them down. When I mentioned the cave, every face turned away, except one, an elder sitting by the fire, wrinkles deep as canyons, eyes like storm clouds that had seen too much. He motioned me closer. "You've been touched by it," he said. "I can smell the fear on you." I swallowed hard. "What is it?" He stared into the flames a long moment before answering, voice cracked like old wood. "Not a spirit, not a beast, something caught between, something that learned hunger from us." I nearly laughed at the absurdity, until he placed a weathered hand on mine and whispered, "Creatures of the forest don't mimic voices. They don't laugh. They don't ask permission to enter your home. I leaned closer. Quiet. Begging. How do you stop it? He didn't blink. He didn't breathe. He simply said, "You don't." He looked up then, eyes shining with a pain that made my skin crawl. The forest doesn't want it here anymore, but it can't fight what it once protected. He squeezed my fingers with surprising strength. That makes you its only enemy. I pulled my hand away, but not fast enough to hide the fear. He saw it, smelled it, sat back and nodded slowly. That's why you haven't died yet. Before I could ask what he meant, he whispered something that has lived in my skull ever since. The ones it hunts, it keeps alive longer. For sport, for learning, for curiosity, because fear is the finest seasoning. Now, when I lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the first knock, I wonder how close it really is. In the attic, under the floorboards, behind the tree line, behind the window glass, behind my reflection. I wonder if it wears Ellis's face tonight. Or Hart's. Or mine. And sometimes I swear I hear footsteps inside the walls. Slow, deliberate, learning, waiting for the moment I finally look away. Some nights I wake up before the knocking starts. That's how I know I'm not in control anymore. The fear knows the rhythm better than my heartbeat. I lie there, staring into the dark, holding my breath like a sinner, holding a confession. The walls around me feel thinner every night, the locks less trustworthy, the air more aware. But now there's something new. Sometimes I hear breathing inside the cabin, not outside, not beneath the floorboards, inside the same room where I sleep. I'll open my eyes slowly, terrified of what I'll see, and every time the room looks normal, chair where I left it, desk neat, boots by the door. But the silence after somehow worse. It means it's waiting. It means it enjoys waiting, because the longer I fear it, the sweeter the inevitable becomes. I used to think of courage as a weapon. Now I know it's a negotiation, one where fear always demands more. And fear has a name carved into the stone of that cave, not a word humans speak, but a shape, a size, a hunger, a lesson. Weeks became months. I stopped reporting everything I saw. The chief stopped asking questions. Denial became a department policy. All the while, the missing posters in our station kept increasing. Faces of hikers, campers, hunters, residents, people whose final footsteps led toward the forest like moths toward a quiet whisper. Officially, they wandered off. Unofficially, they were taken. The government doesn't fight phantoms. It just files paperwork and avoids lawsuits. But knowledge changes a person in irreparable ways. Once you've seen the truth breathing in the dark, you're never unmarked again. Even the forest knows me differently now. Squirrels flee when I approach. Birds fall silent, watching from branches. And the deer, it's like they're waiting for something terrible to happen. To me, I've stopped blaming them. One late autumn evening, clouds choking the moon's light, the chief called me into his office. His face was the color of fear, pale, sunken, aged decades by whatever he'd been hiding his entire career. "We can't protect this land anymore," he muttered. "We were never meant to." He opened a drawer and placed a weathered journal in front of me. The binding was cracked, pages brittle, Whitaker's initials etched into the cover with a knife tip. "I shouldn't show you this," the chief whispered, "but I think you already know too much to survive the lie." Inside were sketches, crude charcoal drawings of the cave, the tracks, the towering silhouette, the eyes. Broad strokes of black marked a cavern inside the mountain, labeled in white pencil, the place where names die. Page after page, Whitaker chronicled his descent into obsession. The thing had stalked him, spoken to him, borrowed voices of loved ones long dead. One passage chilled my blood. "It doesn't kill you because you're prey. It kills you because you're interesting. Enough fear can change a man's shape." The chief closed the journal gently, too gently, like he feared it might scream. "You've lasted longer than most," he said. "It likes the ones who fight the fear. The flavor lingers." Then he leaned forward, breath shaking. "When the forest chooses you, there's no retirement." His words dissolved any illusion of safety left in me. I wasn't just assigned to this forest. I was claimed by it. There are nights when I think about walking back to that cave, not out of bravery, not even out of duty, but to finish the story before it finishes me. Because lately the mimicry has been getting bolder. It doesn't only use my voice now, it uses the voices of the ones I failed. Heart, I'll hear whispered behind me, the smell of pine and rot curling into the room. Grandpa, in a child's broken cadence. Please, help. Ellis's once steady voice distorted into a plea that tears flesh from bone. It wants me to come back. It wants the chase, and I fear that part of me, a part twisted by sleepless nights, wants it too. Fear doesn't just weaken, it shapes. The pines outside my window sway even when the air is still. Branches stretch like arms, trunks bend like ribs, the whole forest shifting into something alive and aware, watching. Always watching. Locals still whisper their stories, but they never mention the cave, not directly. Instead, they warn newcomers about rules. Don't whistle after dark, don't travel alone, don't follow voices calling your name. And if you hear knocking, don't answer. But they don't explain why. They can't. The truth turns the tongue to stone. Tourists laugh at the superstition. Survivors never laugh. I used to be proud of my badge, proud to protect something wild, but protection implies control. We have none here. The forest draws its boundaries in blood. Every missing poster is a reminder of that. Every empty cabin, a monument. Rangers are not guardians. We are witnesses. Witnesses to something older than fear. Something that existed before the first campfire. Something that looked at early humanity with curiosity and hunger, and chose hunger. I don't know how my story ends, but I know where. Sooner or later, I'll stand again at the mouth of that cave, the cold breath of earth pouring out like the exhale of a sleeping god. The pines will watch, not from malice, but from helplessness, and it will greet me with whatever face it has stolen last. Ellis. Heart. Maybe even my own. It will smile, it will wait, and I will step into the dark, not because I am brave, but because fear brought me home. If you ever wander into these woods, into the places locals still whisper about, remember this. Don't follow the quiet. Don't look back when the trees go still. Don't run when you hear your own voice calling for help. And if you smell wet fur and ancient earth, it's already too late. Some spirits guard the pines, some haunt them. But one spirit, the one that mimics footsteps and laughter and the shape of your hope, it hunts the pines. And it never forgets a name it has learned to pronounce. Even now, as I finish speaking these words, I hear footsteps on the porch outside, slow, confident, repeating mine. It knows I am telling you this story. It knows you're listening. And one day soon, when you hike a little too far, stay a little too late, ignore the warnings written in silence, you might hear knocking 3 times, then 3 again. Don't open the door. Please, don't open the door. Because if you do, it will finally have a new voice to use, a new shape to wear, a new name to whisper in the darkness of that cave. Yours. Fear isn't born in the dark. It's born in the moment you realize the dark has been watching you back. My name is Michael. I'm 35 years old, and for the last 8 years, the Ouachita National Forest has been more than my workplace. It's been my home, my pride, and maybe my slow undoing. People hear park ranger and imagine peaceful trails, bear safety lectures, campfire smiles for kids who think the woods are their playground. The truth is, the woods are older than any of us can grasp. Older, deeper, and not always interested in being understood. The locals in western Arkansas will tell you the forest remembers everything. They say the pines here have roots that dig not just through soil, but memory. They say the wind carries voices that once belonged to men who never found their way back. I didn't believe that when I first arrived. I grew up in Little Rock, city lungs, city doubts. But the longer I've been stationed here, the harder it is to pretend that the forest doesn't have a pulse. Most nights I take patrol along an old logging road called Ridge Spur 22. It's about 8 miles from the ranger station, not too remote, but just far enough that you feel separation settle into your bones. The kind of place where your radio crackles like it knows something you don't. My job is straightforward. Make sure campers have permits, fires are out, and no one's shooting off fireworks or trying to carve their names into ancient bark. But that's the official job. What no one writes down, what even we rangers try not to admit, is that our real job is to keep track of the things that want people to disappear. My first month on Ridge Spur 22 should have been an easy one. Spring had just started biting into winter's leftovers. The nights smelled like melting frost and old pine needles. The wind came down from the hills and swept along the road like an invisible river. There was a quiet hum in the air that felt peaceful if you didn't listen too closely. I remember the first sign that something was wrong. It was just before midnight, my flashlight cutting a narrow slice through the dark. My boots sank into moss that felt too soft, like it had been placed there on purpose. I was scanning the tree line, counting campsites when my radio crackled. A sharp spit of static, then a voice I didn't recognize whispered, "Don't look in the pines." I froze. The words were soft, deliberate, carried on the same frequency as my fellow rangers. I pressed the call button, kept my voice steady. "Station, come back." Nothing. I tried again. "Deb, you there?" Deb was the night dispatcher. Usually she answered by the second call, half annoyed, half amused. Tonight, silence. I told myself it was interference, maybe another signal bleeding through. But it didn't feel like that. It felt intentional, like something had leaned close to the speaker and breathed a warning right into my ear. I swallowed hard and made myself keep walking. There's a stubbornness that comes with this job. The belief that fear is a thing you can ignore if you just keep moving. The road curved into a tunnel of pines, tall, straight, forming black ribs against the silver moon. Their needles rustled like quiet applause or quiet laughter. I didn't know which one bothered me more. Halfway down the stretch, I saw the camp. Smoke rose from a fire that had burned too long, a small orange glow choking against the heavy air. One tent, a picnic table, and muddy footprints leading into the underbrush. A lantern hung from a broken tree limb, swinging gently though there was no wind to push it. I called out, trying not to sound aggressive. "U.S. Forest Service? Anybody there?" Silence. I stepped closer. The tent flap was open just enough to see a bedroll inside. Rumpled. Recently used, a backpack half unzipped, a map laid flat on the picnic table, pinned down by a cheap hunting knife. The paper was torn at the edges, as though someone had been clutching it too tightly. The route drawn led deeper into the forest, up toward a region we didn't mark anymore, not since the late 90s when a pair of hikers vanished out there. Again, my radio spat static. Then, "Look up." It wasn't a voice speaking loudly, more like a voice that knew I would listen even if it whispered. Against my better judgment, I tilted my head back. There, nestled 20 feet up in the pine branches, was a man's shoe. Just one. A brown leather hiking boot, worn at the heel, laces dangling like they'd been chewed through. Next to it, another object caught the moonlight. A single, half-torn flannel shirt sleeve, pinned to the bark by a wooden spike. That's when instinct, the old animal instinct, screamed at me to get the hell away. But duty, that lesser human instinct, made me reach for my flashlight and angle it toward the ground beneath the tree. More footprints. Bare feet. Large. Impossibly large. 5 toes, each one sunk deep into the mud as though the creature they belonged to carried weight beyond reason. I crouched, fingers brushing the edges of one print, and a chill crawled down my arm. The soil was warm. Every rational thought told me to radio for backup. But the fear in my chest wasn't letting me call out, as if speaking would draw attention. I glanced over my shoulder, scanning the forest. Every pine trunk looked like a figure waiting to move. Every shadow looked like it had secrets. I took a slow step back, then another. Behind me, the tree limbs creaked. Pine needles hissed overhead, the soft sound of something shifting its weight. I turned the flashlight upward, but the beam hit nothing. The branches swayed slightly, but there was no wind. And then I heard it. Breathing. Not a quick pant or a frightened gasp. This was deep, measured breathing. The kind that belongs to something sure of itself. something that's been watching you for a long time. My skin tightened, lungs constricting. The breathing didn't come from above anymore. It was somewhere behind me, low to the ground, close enough that if I turned too fast, my face might brush against whatever was there. I swallowed a sound threatening to rise in my throat. Finally, forcing my voice through clenched teeth, I called out, "I'm warning you, I'm armed." A half-truth. I had my sidearm, sure, but the way that breathing sounded, like an animal that had learned patience, made me doubt any weapon would matter. The breathing stopped. Silence returned, thick as night. Then, the footprints. They shifted. I didn't see the movement, only heard the soft suction of mud releasing its grip. A step forward, too heavy for any human, too soft for a bear. My heart punched against my ribs and instinct finally won. I stepped back, then turned and forced myself to walk, not run, down the road, keeping my flashlight aimed ahead so I wouldn't have to face what I felt behind me. A branch snapped. A low grunt rolled through the trees, deep enough to vibrate inside my chest. I couldn't hold back anymore. I ran, hard, boots crunching gravel, lungs burning with freezing air. Something followed, each step shaking the ground barely, but enough for my body to feel the rhythm of pursuit. Don't look. Don't look. If you look, it knows you see it. I reached my truck, flung myself inside, slammed the door. My fingers fumbled the keys, too slow, too clumsy, while my breath fogged the windshield. The moment the engine roared, I hit the gas. Gravel spat behind the tires like sparks. But even as the truck shot forward, I could feel eyes on me. Eyes that didn't belong to anything we categorize on park reports. Eyes that wanted me to come back. At the station, I sat in my vehicle long after the engine died, hands shaking, radio silent on the passenger seat. When Deb finally called asking if everything was all right, I lied. Told her the line had dropped, told her the woods were quiet tonight. I didn't sleep when I got home. I didn't move from my window, watching the trees along the lot sway like tall figures, hoping I'd step outside. That was just the first night, and the Ouachitas weren't done with me. When morning finally crawled across the sky, I convinced myself that exhaustion had twisted shadows into predators. A rational mind will always try to tame fear before admitting anything truly impossible. Still, I filed a report about the abandoned campsite and hiked back out once the sun was high enough to drown out nightmares. But in daylight, the scene was wrong in a different way. The muddy footprints were gone, not washed away. Gone. No smears, no disturbance, not even the indentation where I'd knelt. The boot and the torn sleeve, also gone. Only the broken limb from which the lantern had hung remained. The map and knife were missing. Even the ashes from the fire barely existed anymore, just a gray stain like someone had scraped every trace of life away. What bothered me most wasn't the disappearance. It was how clean the forest looked. Pristine, like it had been reset overnight. I told myself the camper must have returned while I drove back to the station, that I imagined the footprints. Maybe another ranger retrieved the belongings. Maybe my nerves wrote part of the story. I finished cleanup, then stopped at the old store near the county road. Locals called it the Pine Bend Market, a gas station, bait shop, hardware store, and rumor mill all in one squat building. The boards creaked when you stepped inside, and the air smelled like cedar and dust. Old Man Lewis ran the place, hair white as bird bones, skin creased like dried riverbeds. He knew every hunter, every logging crew, every strange tale that drifted out of the woods on whiskey breath. He watched me walk in. His smile didn't reach his eyes. A ranger out this early? Must have been a long night, he said, wiping his hands on an oil-stained rag. I grabbed a coffee. Black, because anything sweet felt childish after the midnight I'd had. Quiet night, I lied. Lewis chuckled. Quiet don't always mean peaceful, son. I tried to laugh it off, but he set the rag down and leaned across the counter. His voice dropped low, like he expected the pines outside to be listening through the walls. You were on Ridge Spur 22, weren't you? A chill crawled up my spine. How did you? Fire smoke on your coat, mud from the ridge road. I pay attention. He paused. Tell me, anything go missing out there? His eyes weren't curious. They were knowing. I set my jaw, refusing the bait. Just a camper forgetting to check in. Nothing strange. He stared at me for a long, uncomfortable moment. Then he said, well, if you see something big out there, something go wet that breathes like a freight engine but moves quieter than a fox. His gaze drifted to the windows facing the forest. Don't follow it, and don't let it follow you. I couldn't tell if he was warning me or testing how much I believed. What is it you think is out there? I asked. Lewis's lips pressed into a thin line. City folks call it a myth, but my father hunted these woods all his life, said there's something in those pines older than our history here. A watcher, a collector of wanderers who dare its hills. Are you talking about a bear? A mountain lion? His eyes snapped back to mine. Bears don't clean up a campsite like a lady tidying her parlor. The conversation was pulling too close to the truth I was trying to hide from myself. I changed the subject, paid, and left. But as the screen door clapped shut behind me, Lewis called out, if you start hearing breathing and you ain't breathing, run. The day passed in mandatory normalcy. Paperwork, gear checks, and orientation for 2 new volunteers. For a while, I let sunlight erase the memory of those massive prints, the voice on the radio, the heavy presence behind me. Fear is fragile in daylight. Night is when it feeds. At dusk, I returned to patrol, avoiding Ridge Spur 22 like a coward or a smart man. But the Ouachitas don't care about our choices. They decide where the night leads. The first sign was the smell, pine sap and damp leaves, then something sourer, like old blood crusted on metal. My flashlight beam cut across the ditch, scanning for animal carcasses, when the radio hissed again. A soft static that didn't come from any call. No words this time. Just struggling breath, the same deep, measured rhythm I'd heard behind me the night before. I clicked the radio off entirely. Silence was better than hearing that thing again. My route looped me past an overlook where tourists like to take pictures in the fall. Cliffs drop into a valley thick with pines, a dark ocean of spikes that sway like waves when the wind rolls in. Tonight, the wind was still. Every tree stood dead straight, unmoving, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Then I saw it. Far below, one tree stood different. Stripped of its needles, its branches bare and pale like bone. At the very top, impaled through its trunk, hung something dark. I lifted my binoculars, a deer, or what used to be one. Its limbs were bent backward unnaturally, head twisted toward the sky with its mouth wide open. No scavenger did this. No animal drags a full-grown deer up a tree and leaves it like an ornament. My throat tightened. The valley pressed heavier against my lungs. When I lowered the binoculars, I wasn't alone on the overlook anymore. A man stood 10 feet away. I hadn't heard him approach. Not a step, not a breath. He wore a hunter's jacket, mud up to the knees, face hidden beneath a hood deep enough to shade his features. I forced composure. Sir, this area is closed after dark. You'll need to head back to... He turned his head toward me. The hood slipped just enough for moonlight to find his eyes. They were wrong, too reflective, too sharp, catching the light like a nocturnal animal's. Not a hunter, not normal. Before I could step back, his voice came out, quiet, strained, like he hadn't used words in years. It sees you. My pulse hammered through my ears. Who sees me? He raised one shaking arm and pointed toward the black valley behind me, toward the deer twisted in the branches. The watcher in the pines. You shouldn't have looked up. His chest heaved, breath ragged. Then he stumbled backward, vanishing into the dark without turning around, melting into the tree line as though he belonged there. I could have chased, should have. But my legs felt bolted to the ground, words tangled inside me like roots choking a fallen log. Because deep in those pines, at the base of that bone-white tree, something moved. Not a person, not a deer, something enormous. A shadow broke away from the base of the trunk, too tall, shoulders broader than any beast I knew. The movement was deliberate, slow, a predator that doesn't need speed because fear freezes its prey. My flashlight flickered, once, twice, then dimmed to a sickly glow. The shadow lifted its head, Two eyes burned through the darkness, faint but visible, like embers pressed into a skull too heavy for the living world. And that breathing returned, not from the radio, from the valley itself. The creature inhaled, the branches rising with it, and every pine around us seemed to listen. I stepped back. Gravel shifted under my boot. The glowing eyes locked onto mine. That tiny sound, a pebble sliding, had sealed me in its awareness. The breathing grew louder, closer. It was no longer in the valley. It climbed, steps pounding quietly up the slope like a heartbeat growing louder. I bolted for my truck, stumbling over rocks, lungs tearing for air. Trees blurred, radio chatter erupted behind me, other units signaling in confusion as I sprinted. I didn't stop, didn't look back, because I knew if I saw how close it was, I might never move again. When I reached the station, I turned off the engine and sat in the dark, listening, breathing. Not mine, not human. Somewhere out there, in the endless black, it knew my name without needing to hear it. And the forest wasn't trying to protect me anymore. It was inviting the thing closer. Sleep didn't come that night. Every time my eyelids sagged, I heard the rhythm of those footsteps climbing the slope, the wet sound of breathing just behind me. Even inside my house, with locks bolted and lights blazing like a signal fire, I felt watched. At dawn, I forced myself back to the station. Routine is a thin shield, but it's better than nothing. That morning, the supervisor called for a missing person search. A teenager, Joel Gilbert, 17, went camping with friends near the Blue Ridge segment of the forest and never came back to the tent after going to relieve himself. His friends assumed he'd wandered too far, maybe fallen asleep by the trail, but the terror in their voices said otherwise. One kid, Andrew, insisted Joel was grabbed by something tall, said he'd heard a grunt, a sound like trees being dragged through the dirt. He swore the moonlight flickered. I used to see fear like that as hysteria. Now I saw it as truth still in denial. We assembled 3 teams, each with radios, flares, and GPS. Like any of that would matter if what I'd seen the last 2 nights was real. My unit headed upslope toward a ravine known for quick drop-offs and loose shale. I volunteered for the front, partly out of duty, but mostly because I needed to know if the monster stalking me was stalking others too. The woods felt hungover, heavy from too much moonlight the night before. Mist clung to the pines, threads of white weaving between trunks, like ghostly limbs stretching for balance. Every bird call sounded like a warning. Every snapped twig felt like a threat. After 2 hours of searching, we found the first sign. A boot print. Not Joel's. Not anyone's I wanted to identify. The same massive track I'd seen at the abandoned campsite, deep enough to pool with groundwater. My stomach tightened. The deputy beside me, Shaw, whistled low. "What the hell walks around here barefoot?" didn't answer. I couldn't. He might have laughed off any reply I gave, but the truth choked behind my teeth. We paused only long enough to mark the location, then continued uphill. The mist thickened, swallowing sound. I motioned for Shaw to slow down, but he didn't see me. He was already vanishing into the fog. My voice caught in my throat like a swallowed stone. Shaw wasn't walking anymore. He was being watched. I saw him stop, tense, his shoulders rising as he scanned the shifting white haze. The way he gripped his radio said he felt danger, not uncertainty. I closed the distance fast, boots sliding on wet needles. When I reached him, he pointed toward the tree line. "There," he whispered. "Something just stepped behind that log." We waited. Silence. Then a crack, the sound of something large shifting its footing. Shaw raised his rifle slightly, not aiming yet, but primed. "Show yourself," he called. The voice that answered wasn't Shaw's or mine. It was Joel's. I found a cave. His words were strangled, flat, like someone repeating a phrase they didn't understand. It came from the direction of the log, from deep within the fog. Shaw's eyes widened. Relief collided with terror on his face. "Joel, stay put. We're coming to you." But something primal inside me screamed. "No." I caught Shaw's arm. "That's not him." His jaw clenched. "He needs help." "That's not his voice." And it wasn't, not exactly. It was Joel's tone, his throat, but the wrong rhythm. like something had recorded him and played it back with pieces missing. Shaw yanked his arm free. "We're not leaving a kid out here." He stepped toward the log. The fog swallowed him too quickly. I started after him, but then the breathing returned, deep, slow, like a bellows bigger than any living creature should contain. It vibrated the ground under me. Pine needles trembled as if the forest itself was frightened. I dropped to a crouch, flashlight trembling in my grip. Shaw's voice cracked over the radio. "Station, I've got eyes on the boy. I think he's... Oh God, what's wrong with him?" Screaming ripped through the speakers. Something thrashing. Shaw's panic shot through the air like lightning. "Help, for Christ's sake!" His voice twisted into terror, and then his radio cut off. I kicked into motion, sprinting through the fog toward where I last saw Shaw. Branches clawed at my arms, mud sucking at my boots. A tree root snagged my foot. I hit the ground hard but rolled, scrambling up again. My lungs seized on the cold air. The fog thinned just enough for me to see movement ahead. Something dragging itself across the dirt. I rushed forward. It was Shaw. He was crawling toward me, gasping, legs limp as dead ropes behind him. His hands dug trenches into the soil. When I reached him, his fingers latched onto my pant leg with desperate strength. "Don't look," he croaked. His face was slack with terror. I grabbed under his shoulders and hoisted him upright, but he stumbled forward as if weightless, or as if his legs no longer belonged to him. "Where's Joel?" I demanded. His pupils were blown wide, reflecting the gray light like obsidian mirrors. When he spoke, his words shook. "It took him into the cave." His lips split with the effort. Fresh blood trickled from the corner of his mouth. "We shouldn't go there. Not ever." Blood dripped from his ears next, his nose. Shaw's body shuddered, and he sagged in my arms, muscles going limp. I lowered him to the ground, shaking his shoulders, calling his name again and again. No pulse. Dead. And whatever had killed him hadn't needed claws or teeth. It had destroyed him from the inside. Footsteps approached, not from behind, not from the direction we came, but from everywhere. Heavy, intentional. The ground shuddered with each impact. I signaled distress on the radio, voice barely steady enough to form words, and several units responded, their chatter piercing my ears, but none of them were close enough. Not yet. A low grunt echoed, the same sound that had crawled along my spine days ago, deeper now, confident, triumphant. The fog shifted like curtains opening, and there, barely visible between two hulking pines, was the silhouette, taller than any man, shoulders so broad they eclipsed the tree trunks behind it, arms hanging long, knuckles nearly brushing the earth. The faintest glow burned where eyes should be. I raised my firearm, a pathetic gesture. My hand quaked like a torn leaf. My voice cracked into the cold. "Stay back, back." The silhouette didn't move, but the fog behind it did. More shapes stirred. Large shapes. The forest groaned under their weight. My mind raced with a single horrifying realization. There wasn't one watcher. There were many. I fired a single shot into the air, not at them, but for every ranger rushing to our aid, and the shapes melted back into the fog, slow, unthreatened, like they knew time was on their side. Within minutes, the clearing was flooded with rangers and EMTs. Shaw's body was airlifted out. They asked 100 questions. What did I see? What happened? Did I discharge my weapon in panic? I answered carefully. I saw a figure, something charged. Visibility was low. I didn't mention voices that mimicked teenagers or monsters that could crush a deer and pin it to a treetop. People die in the woods all the time. Accidents, exposure, animal attacks. But admit the forest is hunting us? That's how you lose your badge, or your mind. By sunset, the fog had cleared, but the pines felt closer. The silence too thick. Nothing in the woods had retreated. They were simply waiting for night. Before we left the scene, one ranger, Davis, picked up what looked like a scrap of clothing caught on a thorn. He held it up, a flannel shirt sleeve, half torn. "Poor kid," he muttered, folding it into an evidence bag. I stared at it until my temples throbbed. I'd seen that exact torn sleeve before. The first night, pinned to a tree with a wooden spike, which meant this creature didn't just stalk victims. It brought pieces of previous prey to where new prey would be found. A warning. a trophy, a promise. When the others packed up, I lingered, staring into the pines, forcing myself to face the direction Shaw had crawled from. I thought I saw the hint of a dark cave opening in the hillside far beyond, a slit in the earth that could swallow Hope whole. It wasn't what I saw that terrified me. It was what I felt. Something inside that darkness was waiting for me by name. It's strange how grief works in the wilderness. In the city, loss is followed by noise, sirens, crying, paperwork, funerals. Out here, loss is followed by silence, a silence so complete it feels like the forest is absorbing every trace of the dead. We all said Shaw was a hero. In the reports, he died trying to save a missing kid. The official cause was internal trauma from a fall, as though rocks and roots had crushed the life out of him. I went along with it because what else could I do? Tell them his insides collapsed because he saw something that shouldn't exist? Joel remained missing. His parents camped outside the ranger station for 2 days, refusing to leave. Their son's body might never be found. I saw the father pacing the parking lot, staring into the trees as if daring them to give his boy back. Each hour I stayed quiet felt like a betrayal. But truth wouldn't bring Joel home. It would only invite more victims. That night I sat alone in the station. The lamps buzzed overhead. The logbook sat open in front of me, pen hovering uselessly. The silence pressed down like wet soil. Then the phone rang. Unknown number. Local line. I answered. U.S. Forest Service, Ranger Michael speaking. Static crackled, then a voice, brittle and hollow. I found a cave. Joel's voice. Every hair on my body stood on end. Where are you? My throat was dry. Joel, if you can hear me, we're coming for you. Just tell me. The same line again, the same cadence. I found a cave. This time, faint, like he was farther away, not speaking to me, repeating something. I slammed the phone down and bolted outside. The night air clung to my lungs, thick as tar. I grabbed my gear, flashlight, weapon, radio, and took the truck back toward Blue Ridge. The road snaked through black trees that seemed to crowd closer each mile. My headlights cut only a thin ribbon of safety. Beyond that, the forest was a living thing waiting for me to step into its mouth. I parked where we'd found Shaw. I wasn't thinking about protocol or waiting for backup. A kid was out here alone, and part of me hoped saving him would erase the guilt gnawing at my ribs. The mist was lighter tonight, but the darkness felt heavier, like someone had draped the sky in a funeral cloth. I walked toward the slope, past the ribbons we'd tied to mark the search grid. Each one fluttered weakly, like they wanted to tear free and escape. As I approached the hillside, the ground curved into a shadowed depression, barely visible unless you knew where to look. A chill rushed through me the closer I got, like the air itself was warning me to turn around. Then I saw the opening, a jagged crack in the earth, just wide enough for a man to slip through. Bushes twisted around it like skeletal hands trying to hide something buried. A faint sour smell seeped out, decay mixed with damp rock. My flashlight beam probed inside. The cave walls were narrow, slick with dark moisture. The passage bent and disappeared into deeper darkness. I whispered Joel's name once. No answer, just air that exhaled back. I ducked down and slipped inside. The ceiling scraped my shoulders at first, forcing me to hunch. My boots crunched over loose stones and discarded bones, small ones. Squirrel, rabbit, maybe something bigger. The tunnel steepened, walls opening wider as I descended. Every step felt like surrendering to a gravity that didn't belong to this world. Farther in, I saw symbols carved into the rock, sharp, overlapping lines, like humanoid figures with exaggerated limbs towering over smaller human shapes. The drawing spiraled deeper into the cavern, telling a story I didn't want to understand. The deeper I went, the louder the breathing became. Not my breathing. Steady, rhythmic, patient. Like something massive was asleep inside the earth, and my footsteps were its lullaby, turning into a wake-up call. The tunnel widened into a chamber so large my flashlight couldn't find the walls. The smell intensified, rust and old blood. My beam landed on something lying near the center of the cavern. A backpack. Blue. Torn. Joel's. I rushed toward it, heart pounding. Joel! My voice echoed into the void, vanishing too fast, like the darkness swallowed every sound as soon as it formed. A scraping noise behind me. I spun around, my light jittered. A figure crouched in the dark, small, human. Joel. He was curled on his side, facing away from me. He had arms tucked under his chest like he was protecting himself from cold that didn't exist. Joel, I breathed, kneeling down. I put a hand on his shoulder and flinched, freezing. Not from temperature, from something that felt wrong, like touching stone pretending to be skin. Slowly, Joel's head turned toward me. His eyes were open, but not focusing. Pupils blown wide and milky, like they were reflecting the cave instead of seeing it. His lips parted. "I found a cave," he whispered, and that smell, copper and rot, spilled from his mouth. I staggered back, bile rising. Joel's head twitched, then his jaw snapped open wider than any person's should. A wet crack rang out as his bones strained. His voice gurgled, deeper this time. "He's watching." The breathing halted. Silence strangled the cavern. Then a footstep, a single thunderous step. Dust rained from the ceiling. Pebbles rolled across the ground. Another step, closer. Joel's hand shot out, grabbing my wrist with inhuman strength. His nails dug deep into my skin. His next words slithered out, "He wants you to take his place." I tried to pull away. He clung tighter. Another step. The cave throbbed with its weight. I ripped my arm free, skin tearing. Joel collapsed, body folding like a puppet whose strings had gone slack. My instincts shrieked, "Run!" So I did. Flashlight beam bouncing wildly, breath ripping my throat raw. The cave roared behind me as the footsteps accelerated, slow but unstoppable, like the ground itself hunted me. I scraped through the entrance, palms bleeding against rough stone. The night air hit me like a slap, but the breathing behind me surged, furious now. I crashed through brush, branches slashing my arms. Ahead, the trail, the truck. I didn't look back, not once. Some horrors gain shape only when you grant them your eyes. I slammed the door and started the engine with shaking fingers. The headlights burst through the dark onto something standing at the edge of the tree line. A massive silhouette, two burning eyes, watching. But it didn't approach. It didn't need to. It had dragged me into its home. It had shown me what it was. And now all it had to do was wait. I drove until the trees thinned and the stars looked human again. At my house, I locked the doors and barricaded the windows. But long after midnight, sleep never came, because the breathing never stopped. It was outside, waiting, knowing, loving the anticipation of the hunt. I thought sunlight would save me. That morning would pry fear from my skull like a mother peeling fingers from a trembling child. But dawn brought no peace. The breathing outside my house faded just before the first birds woke, and when I dared peek through the blinds, the pines across my yard stood perfectly still, silent, too silent, like they hadn't spent all night watching me watch them. I called in sick. They told me to rest, but rest is a luxury the haunted don't get. My arm ached where Joel had torn at me, 10 crescent punctures like an animal's bite, a memory carved into skin. I cleaned the wounds and wrapped them, but the real infection was deeper. Whatever lived in those woods had looked at me, and I could still feel that look. By late afternoon, I drove back to Pine Bend Market. If Lewis really knew more, it was time to stop pretending ignorance was protection. The bell jangled as I pushed inside. Lewis looked up from a newspaper, and the moment his eyes landed on me, his expression fell. "You saw it, didn't you?" I didn't bother playing dumb. "It killed a ranger, and it has Joel." Lewis closed the newspaper slowly. "Not has. Keeps." His voice shook with a centuries-old fear. Those that disappear in the Ouachitas don't wander. They're taken. "To the cave." He winced like I'd cursed. "You went in. It wasn't a question. I had to. Joel was..." "No," he snapped, louder than I'd ever heard. "No, you don't go into a sleeping god's den and walk out without owing something." The store felt smaller suddenly. Air heavier. A echoed. Lewis wiped his forehead with the back of his wrist. For the first time, he looked truly old. Long before the tribes settled this land, before any man mapped these roads, there were the tall ones. Forest keepers, guardians of what should stay buried. They watched from the pines, kept balance. But when settlers came, they hunted the land, cut the timber, and the tall ones changed. His eyes drifted toward the pines, visible through the dusty window. They learned hate and hunger. I leaned closer. What do they want with people? Memory, Lewis replied softly. They collect the mind before they take the body. They feed on fear, on the moment a human knows there's no escape. They like when a heart breaks inside the earth. I felt sick. Then Joel. He's already dead, Lewis whispered. What's left of him is bait. I staggered back, dizzy with guilt and rage. Then we need to put them down, whatever they are. Lewis gave a mournful laugh. Son, if guns could kill them, the pines wouldn't be standing anymore. We tried, for generations. Nothing in his voice held exaggeration, just sorrow too old to fake. Then what stops them? He looked up at me with a question I didn't understand until he spoke the words. What if they aren't trying to be stopped? I shook my head. That doesn't make sense. They choose victims. They send visions. They mark a soul long before they touch it. He pointed to my bandaged arm. Once marked, the forest becomes a trap designed for you. His finger trembled. You're already in the story, Ranger. You just haven't gotten to the part where you scream. I slammed my palm on the counter, the coffee cups rattling. I'm not leaving that kid down there. Lewis grabbed my shirt collar, pulling me close with surprising strength. And that's exactly what they want. He released me. My breath came sharp and shallow. Lewis stepped back, face crumpling in a mixture of fear and pity. You can't save someone who's already been chosen. I left before grief could become tears. The bell clanged behind me like a judge's gavel sealing a verdict. I drove with numb hands. The road blurred. The pain at my wrist throbbed, pulsing with each beat of my heart. The sunset bled red through the pines, an omen wearing the face of a sky. When I reached home, I didn't turn on the lights. Darkness felt honest. Safe was an illusion the daylight sold too easily. Hours passed while I sat at my kitchen table, weapon holstered but close, eyes fixed on the window. A lone pine stood in the yard, one I had admired once for its perfect symmetry. Tonight, it loomed like a sentinel. Midnight approached. That's when the radio I'd left on the table crackled to life. A soft voice, wet with soil. Michael. My heart crashed against my ribs. Joel? But it wasn't just Joel. There were layers beneath his voice. Deeper ones. Growls. Echoes. Movement in throats that shouldn't speak human names. It's so dark down here, the voice said, but something about the angle of inflection felt like it wanted me to feel the darkness more than it existed in it. I reached for the radio, slowly. My fingers hovered. Silence, and then breathing, deep, deliberate, followed by a second voice, a woman's, older. Michael. My mother's voice. My stomach turned. She'd been dead for years. The voice continued, Don't leave me alone down here. I hurled the radio across the room. It shattered against the doorframe, static bleeding from the splintered speakers. But the voices didn't stop. They rose from outside, from the tree line, calling my name, begging, crying, screaming. Every voice belonged to someone I'd once known who'd faded into the forest's unsolved file drawers. Campers gone without a trace, a hunter swallowed by the mountains last winter, hikers whose gear was found but not their bodies. And underneath them all, the creatures breathing. Slow. Hungry. Close. I forced myself to the window, peeling back the blinds with 2 fingers. At first, I saw nothing but trees. Then something shifted near the base of the pine. A broad shoulder. A glint of eyes. The watcher leaned forward, emerging just enough that moonlight kissed the contours of its face. A distorted mask of coarse hair, skin thick like bark stretched over bone far too large. Its mouth hung slightly open, chest rising and falling as though savoring the anticipation. Slowly, it lifted one long arm and pointed to the earth beneath my house. Not the forest, the ground below me. The basement door rattled, once, twice, then slammed hard from the inside. The breathing intensified, now from beneath the floorboards. The watcher's voice, no longer a whisper but a command, vibrated the walls. Come home. Cold sweat soaked my shirt. My hand found the latch for the front door, but froze, because this wasn't a chase. It was a ritual, and the pines were the altar. I stumbled back, knocking over a chair. My thoughts scattered like spooked birds. The truth crashed through me in one horrifying wave. It hadn't been trying to kill me. It had been leading me. Not to the forest, not to the cave, to somewhere deeper. Somewhere human light never sees. And the only way to stop the voices was to answer them. I didn't want to go, but wanting had nothing to do with it anymore. Fear wasn't my enemy. Apathy was. If I stayed, if I tried to ignore the voices, they would only grow louder. They would wear me down like water shaping stone. My mind would break before my bones ever did. That is how hunters turn prey. So I opened the basement door. It wailed open like a throat releasing its last breath. The light switch clicked uselessly. Darkness remained. Thick, alive. The kind of dark that remembers when the world didn't have suns. Something moist breathed back toward me. The air was heavy with rot and soil, as though the earth itself had exhaled. "Come home," the creature had said. Home was descent. I stepped down the stairs, each creak a scream swallowed by the void. At the bottom, a faint draft curled against my ankle, cold and guiding. My flashlight flickered to life, its weak beam trembling. I followed the draft to the far corner, to a small wooden door I had never noticed before. A cellar hatch? No. Smaller. Lower. A crawl space. I knelt, hands shaking as I brushed away a thin layer of old insulation and dirt. The wood beneath was carved, not by tools, but by fingernails. Lines. Scratches. Desperate marks left by someone who had tried to get out, someone who had failed. That was my first chance to turn back. I didn't take it. I lifted the hatch. Blackness rushed up at me with the cold scent of underground rivers and burial chambers untouched by hands that prayed. I squeezed inside on my elbows. The walls brushed my shoulders, too close, too intimate, as though the earth wanted to feel me struggle. The tunnel sloped downward. Soon my house and the world above felt like a forgotten dream. The sound returned, that same labored breathing echoing through the soil. Not behind me. Ahead. Welcoming. The narrow corridor widened, allowing me to crawl faster, heart hammering like a fist on a locked door. My flashlight beam danced over scratches embedded deep into the packed clay walls. Some were new. Some were old enough to feel sacred, human, claw-like, both. Time lost definition down there. Minutes might have passed, or hours. The tunnel opened suddenly into a cavern large enough to swallow my home whole. My flashlight beam vanished upward into black infinity. On the far wall, the engraving again, the emblem I'd seen at Fallen Peak. The X with curling arms, a symbol older than any alphabet. In the center of the cavern, a dome of smooth stone rose like the back of a buried beast. Holes pocked its surface, each the size of a human skull. And from one of those holes, Joel's voice wept. "Please, help me." I moved toward him, flashlight trembling across the rock. The voice grew clearer, layered with choking sobs. "Don't leave me here." My throat closed. The guilt was unbearable. I leaned close, and the hole shuddered. A slick arm reached out, pale skin stretched too tight, muscles bulging wrong, fingers clawed and grasping. Not Joel's arm. Too long, too strong. It groped through the dark, searching for me. I stumbled backward, breath gone, lungs empty of courage. Then came the voices. Not just Joel's. Hundreds, all crying, all pleading. Hands shot out from every hole in the stone, grasping, clawing, stretching their fingernails toward me. They dragged against the rock with a scraping chorus like teeth grinding on bone. This was a crypt. No, a prison, a pantry. Something ancient lived beneath that dome, and the holes were how it fed. A low rumble shook the chamber, a heartbeat in the ground. The ceiling groaned as dust rained down. Loose stones shifted under my boots. Something massive moved below. Something waking. The breathing stopped. Silence swallowed the cavern. Then, emerging from behind the dome, it stood, rising to its full and horrifying height. Not a man. Not an ape. Not any story told around a fire to keep children close. The Watcher, its shoulders brushed stalactites. Its fur was matted with mud and fragments of the graves it had made. Its face, oh God, its face. It was human enough to recognize fear in my reflection. And its eyes, empty holes filled with night. The cavern walls pulsed with every inhale it took, its ribs expanding like the bellows of a furnace designed to burn hope. When it exhaled, dead leaves blew across the floor as if the forest itself breathed through it. It spoke without lips, without mercy. You are mine. I pulled my gun, instinct, not logic. The shot echoed like thunder, blinding me with muzzle flash. When sight returned, the creature still stood, unfazed, but its gaze locked onto my wrist, my bandaged wrist, the marked wrist. Blood had soaked through the gauze. It inhaled, slow, savoring the scent of inevitability. We choose, it said. We keep. And that's when I finally understood. Joel had never been the target. I was. I ran, boots slipping on dust and loose stone, lungs burning. The cavern buckled behind me as the creature's roar shook the walls. Its footsteps thundered, crushing centuries underfoot. The tunnel wasn't a passage, it was a throat, and I was being swallowed. My flashlight died, darkness becoming skin tight. My hands found the walls, dragging me forward, tearing flesh. My own breath came in screams. The creature's growling filled the space, closing in. The floor began to incline. I was climbing, faster, faster, fingers clawing at dirt and root and hope. Above, a glimmer of moonlight. The hatch. I burst through the opening, scraping my shoulders raw, slammed the basement door shut, and threw a heavy shelving unit against it just as something slammed from below. Boom. Dust cascaded from the ceiling. Boom. The walls shuddered. Boom. Then, silence. I collapsed on the floor, chest convulsing. Every instinct screamed to run, but shock had locked my limbs. Hours passed in the blink of a scream. Dawn crept across my window like a shy apology. But apologies don't bury truth. When I finally rose, every bone trembled. I looked outside. The lone pine in my yard stood motionless, except something dangled from one branch. A strip of fabric, Joel's shirt, tied like a surrender flag, or a promise. The forest wasn't done. It never would be. The forest does not wait for you to believe in its ghosts. It simply continues breathing long after you've convinced yourself that nothing out there is watching. That's what I learned beneath the towering pines of the Pacific Northwest, where the morning fog hangs low enough to brush against your shoulders, and the tree line always feels like edging closer, just a little closer every time you dare look away. My name isn't important anymore. I used to think names mattered, that they were anchors keeping us grounded to who we are. But out here, in an ocean of ancient wood and silence, even the strongest anchor rusts away. Still, to keep this story straight, you can call me the ranger who stayed too long. I'm in my mid-30s, and until recently I worked in a vast forest people around here simply call the Pines. No need for a map. Locals know the rules. Do not camp near the old logging roads. Do not whistle after dark. And if you hear footsteps matching your own pace behind you, keep walking. Most visitors laugh off the whispers. I did too when I first came here. I told myself the legends were just there to scare off curious kids or keep tourists away from hazardous cliffs. I didn't realize the stories were warnings left behind by the ones who made it out. When I first joined the Ranger Service, the supervisors emphasized respecting wildlife, understanding trail maps, and knowing how to navigate without GPS. But they never taught us how to handle the feeling of being watched by something you couldn't see, something clever enough to know every shadow in the trees. One of the earliest strange events happened during my second month. I'd been settling into a rhythm, patrol the trails, check the campsites for leftover trash, warn people not to feed the bears. Easy work. But one particularly fog-heavy morning, I found myself drawn along a stretch of trail that isn't marked on the public maps. It's narrow and uneven, roots tearing through the dirt like skeletal hands. The air changes there. It becomes still, like the forest is holding its breath. I should have turned back. I should have listened to that ancient instinct inside me that quietly muttered no. Instead, I followed the trail. Before long, the sound of flowing streams and distant woodpeckers vanished. All I could hear was my own breath and the crunch of earth under my boots. The trees around me were so dense they swallowed the daylight. It felt like walking through a tunnel carved out of nature itself. That's when I noticed the footprints. They were large, massive, really, and spaced too widely apart to be a bear's. The shape was wrong, too. almost human, but elongated, the front half wider than the heel. I crouched down, tracing the outline in the soil. Whatever made them was heavy, heavier than a moose, heavier than any animal I'd seen tracked here. Instinctively, I looked up. The forest stood still, yet I couldn't shake the sensation that something was above me. Watching. A branch cracked, not a small twig, something thick enough to require real force. My radio hissed in my ear, a sharp burst of static that made me flinch. I whispered into it, asking if anyone was nearby. No response. The footsteps continued, slow, deliberate, matching the speed of my breathing. I told myself it was just a deer, or a hiker I'd somehow missed. But hikers don't move like that. They don't stalk. They don't wait. I turned around and retraced my steps, refusing to break into a run even though every nerve in my body was screaming at me to sprint. The deeper the panic dug in, the slower I forced myself to move. Predators chase what flees, that's what I kept repeating in my head. That, and another thought I couldn't entirely ignore. If the stories were true, running wouldn't save me anyway. When I finally stepped back onto a familiar trail, sunlight slipped through the canopy all at once, like the pines exhaled around me. My radio click crackled, and suddenly I could hear dispatch again. Someone calling my name, asking if I'd gone off the grid. I lied. Told them I just hit a dead spot. But I couldn't unsee those prints. Couldn't unhear those deliberate steps in the brush. That night, in my cabin out near the ranger station, I replayed the moment over and over. The unease sat heavy in my chest like a weight that wouldn't shift. I kept glancing out the window. The trees always stood a few yards from my door, but they'd never felt as close as they did that night, their dark shapes crowding against the glass as if pushing for a better look inside. It didn't take long before the locals heard what I'd encountered. Word spreads fast around here. Every diner booth doubles as a newspaper. Folks listened with narrowed eyes, nodding knowingly, sipping their coffee like they'd been waiting for me to join a club I never knew existed. One of the old-timers, a man who'd been logging these woods since before I was born, leaned in and said quietly, "Sounds like you met the tall one." I tried to laugh it off. The tall one? Was that the best name they could come up with? But the look in his eyes wasn't joking. It was resignation. Fear etched deep into crow's feet and weathered skin. He said there's more than bears and cougars out here, more than wolves and coyotes. Some creatures walk upright. Some don't fear humans the way they once did. Another person chimed in saying if the tall one wants you gone, you'll hear tapping on your cabin walls. 3 slow knocks. Always 3. That's the kind of stuff you hear from tourists who binge wilderness horror stories. It wasn't the kind of thing I expected from locals who've spent lifetimes under these trees. Yet every voice insisting it was real belonged to someone who wasn't smiling. I tried not to let their stories get to me, but fear has a way of threading itself through your thoughts, weaving doubt where confidence once stood. Soon enough, I found myself avoiding that hidden trail entirely. But avoidance is a temporary victory. In forests like this one, the things you evade have a habit of finding you again. A few weeks passed without incident. I almost convinced myself it had all been an overreaction. The pines lull you like that. They let the silence soothe you until you forget that silence is the very thing you should be afraid of. Then came the knocking. It was past midnight when the sound rattled through my cabin walls. 3 heavy knocks, slowly paced, not the frantic scratching of a raccoon, not a woodpecker, nothing natural. The air turned cold enough that my breath fogged the room. My pulse pounded so loudly I couldn't hear anything else. The knocks came again, closer. I reached for my flashlight and stepped into my boots, every movement trembling. The handle of my door felt icy under my grip. With a deep breath that tasted like fear, I pulled it open. Nothing, no one, just the towering pines swaying gently, as if pretending they weren't just pressed against my walls. Then I noticed it. A print in the soft dirt, one of those same massive, stretched footprints, right on my doorstep. The forest held still. And that's when I realized whatever was out there didn't want me wandering into its territory. It wanted to wander into mine. I told myself not to panic, not to feed the fear. But that's the thing about fear in the wild. It grows teeth whether you acknowledge it or not. I stepped back inside, locked the door, and stood completely still, listening, waiting. My ears strained for another knock, another clue that it hadn't been my imagination. But the pines were quiet, too quiet. I barely slept that night, my flashlight clutched to my chest like a lifeline. And in the morning, when the sun finally pried apart the darkness, I stepped outside again. The footprint hadn't vanished. It sat there in the damp earth like a signature, like a message. After that, I started noticing changes. Tools I'd left in the shed moved to different hooks. A trail camera I'd mounted went missing, just the metal screws left behind in the tree. A pair of deer antlers appeared on my porch, intertwined like fingers locked in prayer. I checked for trespassers, hikers who might be messing around, kids trying to spook the new ranger. But deep in my gut, I knew it wasn't kids. Still, I tried to stay rational, tried to stay grounded in the job I'd sworn to do, protect the forest, enforce the rules, keep people safe, even when I wasn't sure I was safe myself. One afternoon, I got a call on my radio about a missing hiker near Cold Creek. Her name was Hannah, mid-20s, so supposed to meet her brother after a short solo hike. She'd never shown. I grabbed my gear and set out to search. Helicopters couldn't fly low enough through the canopy, so most of the searching was on foot. And these searches, they get under your skin. You start imagining every snapped twig as the person calling for help. I found her backpack first. It was torn open, not slashed like by a knife, but stretched apart, like something had hooked into the seams and pulled. Its contents were scattered across the dirt. A water bottle crushed flat, a phone snapped in half, a granola bar wrapper shredded into confetti. No blood, though, no sign of a struggle, just the eerie feeling that she'd vanished mid-step. I radioed in the find, marking coordinates. Then I noticed something else beside the pack, something that stole every thought from my head. Footprints, those same elongated prints, deep, heavy, leading farther into the woods. Every instinct screamed that I should follow them. That's what a ranger does. You pursue answers. You bring people home. But my legs stiffened, because following those tracks meant stepping deeper into the unknown, and I was no longer certain that I or anyone wanted to find what had taken her. I forced myself forward anyway. The trees leaned inward the farther I walked, their branches forming a shelter that blocked out much of the light. The air felt stale here, thick with old bark and damp earth. My breathing sounded too loud, too sharp. I tried calling her name, but my voice felt small, like the pines swallowed it whole. About a mile in, I found movement, just a flicker, but enough to make my heart stall. Something slipped behind a tree, massive and fast. I unsnapped the strap on the bear spray at my belt, my fingers trembling. That's when I saw it. A patch of fabric hanging from a branch, snagged like torn skin, red, bright red. A jacket sleeve, Hannah's jacket. I called her name again. Louder this time, desperation cracking my voice. No response. But the forest answered. A low rumble rolled through the trunks like the growl of something enormous waking from sleep. Birds burst upward, scattering. Every hair on my body lifted. I pressed forward another yard before a cold certainty hit me like a brick wall. If I go any farther, I won't come back. Even thinking it felt like betrayal, like breaking my duty. But survival instincts don't listen to job titles. They answer only to the primal math of life or death. I marked the area and radioed in backup. On the hike back, I heard footsteps behind me again, heavy, controlled, patient, always stopping when I stopped. Always pausing just long enough to let me know they existed. At one point, a pine cone plummeted from above, hitting the ground inches from my boot with a sharp crack. Not dropped, thrown. I didn't look back. When the search team arrived later, with dogs, drones, and enough people to make the forest feel alive again, we found nothing. The sleeve I'd seen, gone. The prints, filled in or erased like the dirt itself, had smoothed over to hide the truth. Search dogs whined, ears pinned back, refusing to track farther than where I'd found the torn backpack. It was as if the pines themselves had closed up around their secret. The official report called it an unresolved disappearance. Happens every year across forests in the US, but I knew better. I could still feel the eyes that had followed me, feel them even now. That night at the station, after everyone had gone home, I sat alone at my desk staring at the blank incident form. They wanted dates, times, conditions, any tracks spotted. Sure, I could list the facts, but how do you log a presence? How do you file something with no name? On patrols, I began noticing strange markings on the trees, deep grooves about 9 feet up, as if something massive had dragged claws along the bark. Sometimes I caught faint whiffs of a musky, rotting scent, an unfamiliar smell that made my eyes water and stomach churn. It clung to the back of my throat like mold. Then there were the sounds, low, guttural calls echoing in the distance. Not wolf, not bear. Something else. Something that tried to mimic the familiar but couldn't hide the wrongness buried underneath. One evening, just as the sun dipped and painted the pines in rust-red light, I met another ranger at the end of a long shift. He'd worked here for years, much longer than me. Normally a talkative guy, but that night he seemed on edge, glancing around like he expected something to step out of the shadows. He asked if I'd seen anything unusual lately. I didn't want to sound paranoid, so I gave a half shrug, half smile, and said, "Just the usual weirdness." He didn't laugh. He told me people vanish here more often than the public hears, that sometimes a person will go missing on one trail and their clothes show up neatly folded miles away, like someone undressed them carefully. Sometimes campers swear they heard a familiar voice calling their name in the dark, only to learn later that the person they heard never left their tent. He leaned in then, voice barely above a breath. Whatever's out there, it knows what scares you most. It learns you. He left before I could ask anything else. That night, staring into the woods from my cabin window, those words gnawed at me. Learns you. I tried convincing myself I was overthinking it, that my mind was making patterns where none existed. But fear warps reality like heat waves off asphalt, bending what you see into what you dread. About a week after Hannah disappeared, I woke up to something brushing against my cabin window, a slow drag like the pads of fingers streaking down the glass. I froze, barely daring to breathe. The noise stopped. I reached for my flashlight again, the weight of it suddenly flimsy, useless. And then another sound replaced the first. Something far worse. My name. Whispered, low and broken, coming from just the other side of the wall. The voice sounded like a woman's, like someone who needed help, someone who wanted me to come out. I remembered what the locals had warned. Don't respond to voices after dark, so I stayed silent. The whispering grew louder, more urgent, more wrong. My name, repeated over and over, warped, dragged through a throat that didn't belong to any human mouth. I clenched my eyes shut and waited. The whispering eventually faded, drifting back into the trees as if swallowed whole. Morning couldn't come fast enough, but the message had been delivered. It wasn't just watching me. It wanted me involved. It wanted me afraid. Fear sharpens the senses in strange ways. It makes the familiar grotesque, the comfortable unsafe. After that night, the voice against the glass, I found myself watching the trees like they were waiting for a cue to move. Every time I stepped outside, the pines felt more like a living thing than a landscape, and I was no longer sure whether I was patrolling them or trespassing. A few days later, I had to hike to an old fire lookout tower deep within restricted territory. The tower had been abandoned decades ago after a structural collapse in the lower stairwell, but the service sometimes sent rangers out to check for squatters or teens using it as a dare spot after drinking. Normally, I wouldn't care. Kids being stupid is part of the job, but now I needed any excuse to leave the cabin. 4 walls weren't enough to keep fear from pacing through the room with me. The path to the tower was long and steep, demanding focus. And that helped. It kept my mind busy with something other than the memory of whispers against glass. Halfway there, I spotted shapes in the distance, 3 figures near the base of the incline. At first, I thought hikers had strayed where they shouldn't, but as I got closer, I realized they weren't moving. They weren't talking. They were just standing there. I called out, announcing myself. Standard Ranger procedure. No response. I slowed. My boots sank slightly into the soft moss as I circled wide to get a better angle. The figures, clothed in flannel jackets and heavy boots, looked like typical backwoods locals, except their heads were tilted upward, eyes fixed on the abandoned tower towering above them. None of them turned to acknowledge me. Something about the stillness was wrong. Not frozen in fear, just frozen, as if someone had hit pause but left the bodies upright. I hesitated. My hand rested on the rescue whistle around my neck, but I didn't dare blow it. When I stepped closer, expecting maybe signs of illness or intoxication, an even stranger detail struck me. Their faces were slack. Not relaxed. Empty. Eyes glazed, mouths parted just slightly, like they were in the middle of inhaling and never finished. For a terrifying moment, the thought clawed into my mind that maybe they weren't alive, but a subtle rise and fall in their chests told me otherwise. They were breathing. Just wrong. I tried again to speak, but only a whisper stumbled out. "Hey, you okay?" Finally, one of them twitched. Slowly, so painfully slowly, it turned its head toward me. The motion wasn't natural or fluid. More like the neck didn't understand how turning was supposed to work. Its eyes, those eyes, were flat, the kind of emptiness you only see in a corpse before the lids are closed. When its lips parted, I prepared for a plea, a name, anything. But instead of words, a low groan spilled out, like wind dragging along the bottom of a rotten door. I stepped back. That triggered the others. Their heads jerked toward me in eerie, uncoordinated snaps, and they began moving. Arms lifting, legs shifting, as if remembering very suddenly how bodies functioned. No instinct told me to stay. Every primal command in my blood screamed, "Run!" And I did. I sprinted up the final stretch toward the lookout tower, dirt flying behind me. My lungs burned with cold air, but I didn't slow, not until I reached the base of the structure and spun around. They weren't chasing me. They just stood in a line now, feet planted in the earth, watching, waiting. Something else was directing them. The tower loomed above, stairs creaking in the breeze, wood warped with age. The place felt abandoned, forgotten, but the pines hadn't forgotten it. I forced myself to climb, each step groaning under my weight. I reached the platform, wind cutting across my skin, heart still in a frenzy. From that height, the line of figures below looked even more wrong. They tilted their heads back up, staring. Then something moved behind them. Tall, dark, its outline hunched but towering over them. A shape that blended into the pines until it shifted, and even then, only slightly. The shoulders were too broad, the arms too long. It took a step forward with a weight that made the ground seem to bow beneath it. I dropped flat against the platform, not daring to breathe. The tower swayed gently, wood complaining under wind or something else. I heard a sound then, far below, rising up like heat shimmer. Not a growl, not any animal call I'd heard in these woods. A layered noise, deep and resonant, vibrating through marrow. The figures responded instantly. They turned, stiff and jerking, and walked back into the forest as though summoned. The tall thing lingered a moment longer, its head lifting. I swear it looked straight at me, even though I was hidden, even though distance should have made me invisible. Something intelligent was behind those dark, unblinking eyes. Something ancient. I stayed in that tower until the sun slipped low behind the trees and shadows stretched long and predatory across the ground. Eventually, I forced myself to climb back down. My legs barely carried me. Every step down the trail felt like a countdown, each heartbeat hammering louder than the last. By the time I reached the ranger station, I was drenched in sweat despite the cold. I filed no report. What would I write? 3 locals were hypnotized, possessed, controlled by a giant thing. I poured coffee into my mug to steady myself, but my hand shook so violently it sloshed over the rim. I spilled more than I drank. That night, I didn't go back to my cabin. I stayed at the station. Too many windows at home, too much glass, too many opportunities for whispers. And I kept telling myself, if that thing wanted me dead, it had its chance. So why didn't it take it? Fear doesn't always present itself as a predator stalking prey. Sometimes it plays patience, a slow unveiling of what lives beyond the rational, what it wants, why it waits. The next week, a couple went missing at a popular campground not far from Cold Creek. Their tent was found zipped from the outside, their cooler untouched, their campfire still smoldering, but their phones were gone, both of them, and only one pair of boots remained near the site. We searched for days, and during one sweep, I found something I'll never unsee. Claw marks, not low, high, nearly 10 feet up, deep gouges torn into a thick cedar trunk, sap running like blood, and worse, a smear of red along the bark below it. I radioed the team. They came fast. But like before, the moment more eyes arrived, the forest hid the truth. The smear faded into brown. The gouges looked old, years old, like I'd imagined the freshness of them. It was then I started to question my own mind. The pines twist perspective, warp reason. But deep down, I understood. The forest wasn't distorting itself. It was distorting me. Not long after, I got a message to report to the office of a senior ranger, one who handled sensitive cases. He shut the door behind me, motioning for me to sit. His desk was covered in paperwork, missing persons' files stacked in neat, depressing piles. He looked tired, not physically, spiritually. "I heard you were at Cold Creek," he said. I nodded. He slid a file toward me. I recognized the faces, Hannah and the missing couple, 3 people gone in less than a month. At first, he spoke clinically, weather hazards, animal attacks, getting lost, but then his voice fell into a lower, heavier register. There are things we don't tell the public, and things we don't usually tell new rangers, because if you knew what you were walking into, you'd never show up for the job. He leaned forward, elbows on the desk. This forest has something in it, something territorial. My blood turned to ice. He continued, "We don't talk about it. We don't acknowledge it in writing, because once you start seeing the signs, once you start believing, it notices you back." He paused, "And it already knows you're watching." That night, a storm rolled over the pines. The wind howled through the branches, rain plastering the windows, thunder cracked like the forest splitting open, and over the chaos of nature, another sound emerged. 3 knocks. Slow, deliberate, on the door of the station. I stared at the wood, heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my teeth. Lightning tore the sky open, and in that flash of violent light, I saw a shadow outside, tall, impossibly tall, leaning close to the glass, watching. The knocks returned, each one a hammer strike against sanity. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. Finally, after what felt like hours, the storm died. Dawn crept through the clouds, and when I dared look again, the shadow was gone. But the door bore fresh marks, 3 vertical scratches, as if something had trailed claws down the wood just to let me know it could open the door if it ever wanted to. The message was clear. It wasn't done with me. Not yet. Sleep became a rare and fragile thing. Every creak of the station, every gust of wind dragging branches across the roof became a warning. I'd jolt awake from dreams of towering silhouettes and hollow voices calling me into the dark. And each morning, though nothing had changed physically, the fear felt heavier, as though it had been rearranging itself inside me while I slept. I told myself I'd request a reassignment soon, that I'd leave before whatever stalked these woods decided curiosity wasn't enough anymore. But the forest has a way of testing your resolve, and it rarely does so gently. 2 days after the storm, another call crackled through the radio. A hunter had gone missing near a place locals call Whisper Ridge, a section of the pines people actively avoid. Even the bravest won't venture there alone. I considered refusing. I considered telling dispatch I was sick, injured, anything to keep away from that place. But the badge weighs heavy, and duty can be foolishly persuasive. I drove out early with a partner that morning, a ranger named Cole, older than me by a decade, calloused hands, calm eyes, the kind of guy you want beside you when the woods start speaking in a voice you don't recognize. We hiked into the ridge, thick ferns lashing our legs. The morning fog clung to us like a living thing. Cole tried to break the tension with idle talk about weather, inventory shortages, the usual, but I barely heard him. Every minute felt like walking deeper into a mouth that was slowly closing. We found the hunter's truck parked crookedly along an animal trail. Driver's door open, keys dangling, fresh boot prints led into the trees. We followed cautiously. Cole called out the man's name. No answer. 50 yards in, the prints stopped. Not faded, not trampled, just stopped, mid-stride. As though one moment he was walking alive, purposeful, and the next he was gone. No drag marks, no sign of a fall, just an abrupt disappearance. Cole muttered under his breath and crouched to study the ground. That's when the forest went quiet. Not peaceful quiet. The kind that feels staged, like an audience holding its breath in anticipation of the next act. A violent one. A sound rose then, slow and mournful. It drifted through the fog like a flute made of bone. Not a bird, not a coyote. Something trying to sound human and failing. Cole stiffened. That's not the wind, he whispered. We drew our radios to update dispatch. Static. Only static. Branches snapped to our right. Something massive pushed through the brush. Unseen, but undeniably present. I smelled that same musky rot, thicker now, like death starting to wake. Cole gripped my shoulder. We leave the same way we came. No argument from me. We backed away slowly, footsteps deliberate. The sound followed, tracking us with predatory patience. And then, a thud. Something heavy landed behind us. I turned instinctively and froze. A figure stood there, not fully visible, not fully hidden, just enough to break the mind. It was tall. Too tall. Shoulders broad enough to eclipse a tree trunk behind it. Thick fur or matted hair cloaked its body in a shaggy darkness. The head was slightly bowed, as if struggling to remain upright on a neck strained under its own mass. A low, wet growl seeped through jagged teeth, barely visible beneath shadow. Its eyes were the worst part. They were alive, intelligent, studying us the way a scientist studies the thing writhing beneath a microscope lens. Time slowed. My hands wouldn't unclench. My breath wouldn't come. Then, another sound. Something like a heartbeat shaking the earth. Deep, powerful, primitive. The creature turned its head toward the noise, muscles rippling beneath fur. Something else was approaching, something even larger. Cole grabbed my arm hard. Run. We ran. Branches scraped my face, roots reached to trip my feet, the forest itself trying to drag me down to whatever fate had claimed so many others. Behind us, two sets of roars crashed into each other. Monstrous, guttural, territorial. The ground trembled. We didn't stop until we burst back into the clearing where the truck waited like a lifeboat. Cole didn't even shut his door before flooring the gas. Trees blurred past in a chaotic smear. I kept staring out the back window, convinced I'd see one of those creatures sprinting after us, its stride tearing up yards of earth at a time. But nothing followed. Not physically. When we returned to the station, Cole slammed the truck door and pressed his back against it, chest heaving. I tried to speak, but words cracked in my dry throat. He looked at me with a terror I never expected from someone like him. If we go back, it won't let us return again. I nodded, still shaking. We filed a report that afternoon. But the story we submitted, an aggressive bear encounter resulting in an incomplete search, was a fabrication. We both knew it, and we both understood the unspoken rule: better a lie that keeps people alive than a truth that invites them to die curious. Later that night, as I sat alone reviewing maps of Whisper Ridge, a thought crept in. Those creatures, they weren't hunting us, they were hunting each other. And we were just trespassing in a war older than any ranger badge. I contemplated calling my family, telling them I was coming home, that this job, this forest, wasn't worth losing myself to shadows. But before I could reach for the phone, the lights flickered. The room chilled. A soft patter drifted against the windows. Rain, I thought. But it wasn't rain, it was tapping. Dozens of tiny taps from every angle, like fingertips or claws, testing the barrier between me and outside. I stood slowly. The tap-tap-tapping grew louder, faster, more coordinated. I wanted to scream, but fear sealed my throat. Then everything stopped. Silence flooded back in. Something waited on the other side of that glass. I could feel its breath against the pane. A single scrape etched downward. Slow, purposeful, leaving a visible mark. I stepped backward and knocked a folder of missing persons reports onto the floor. Pages scattered everywhere. I knelt to gather them just to give my hands something to do, and a photo slid face up toward my boot. It was the hunter we searched for earlier, except this photo was taken feet away from where the prints ended. In the background, just barely visible in the tree line, was a towering figure. Out of focus, distorted by movement, but unmistakably real. My pulse hammered, my vision blurred. This wasn't coincidence, wasn't random, it was escalation. The pines weren't content just to watch me anymore. They were letting me know, you're part of the story now, a piece on a board you can't see, a target that can't outrun its hunter. I closed my eyes and listened. Outside, the trees groaned as the wind picked up or as something brushed past them. Somewhere in the darkness, a deep roar echoed, faint but undeniable, answered by another, farther away, and then a chilling reminder of everything I'd been trying to forget. My name, whispered again, but this time from the ceiling above, and the voice wasn't pleading. It was hungry. I didn't wait to hear my name again. Survival isn't noble, it's instinct. I grabbed my jacket, flashlight, and the only weapon I had worth holding, a flare gun. Then I stepped outside. The night clung to me like pitch, thicker than darkness should ever be. My boots sank into soil that felt freshly turned, as if the earth itself had shifted recently. The pines stood silent, expectant. Fog gathered low and slithered between the trunks like a living thing. Every branch groaned with the weight of stillness. The forest no longer looked like trees. It looked like ribs of a massive beast, ready to close. I didn't know where I was going, only away from whatever whispered from within the station walls. My breath came fast, frost drifting into the void ahead. The air carried a smell like metallic decay, old blood, old hunger. As I walked, shapes flickered at the edges of my vision, shadows taller than any man slipping between pines. The fear that had stalked me for months finally stepped forward, ready to claim its due. The earth trembled once, just a small shiver, but enough to send birds fluttering into the black sky. Something big was moving nearby. Multiple somethings. I switched off my flashlight, better to be blind than seen. Ahead, a faint glow pulsed through the trees, like a lantern swaying in the dark. My legs carried me toward it before my mind agreed. The light grew brighter, and a clearing emerged. In the center stood a small wooden cabin, aged and bent, as if the forest had tried to crush it and failed. Lantern light flickered from inside. As I stepped closer, I noticed claw marks along the logs, some fresh, some older than the cabin itself. Windows boarded. Door half open. A trap or salvation? Either way, it offered shelter from the open dark. I slipped inside. The door creaked shut behind me on its own. The cabin was quiet, dust hanging in the beam of the weak lantern. A small radio sat on a table, its static humming like insects in the walls. Beside it lay photographs. Stacks of them. Missing hikers. Families still searching. Faces frozen in naive smiles before the pines swallowed them. My stomach twisted as I recognized one of them, Hannah. Same jacket I'd found torn in the woods. Same eyes that now stared directly into mine from the photo. A heavy thud hit the cabin roof, shaking the rafters. Dust rained down like ash. Then another thud. Louder. Closer. They knew I was here. I grabbed the lantern and moved deeper into the cabin. A basement door sat crooked at the far wall. It was cracked open, and cold breath wafted up from the darkness below. Curiosity didn't lead me there, but instinct did. I descended. The smell hit me first, earth mixed with rot. Bones stacked like firewood lined the dirt walls. Deer, elk, and human. Clothing scraps tangled between ribs. A necklace still clasped around one shattered skeleton. I nearly retched, but the worst part wasn't the remains. It was the carvings above them. Symbols etched into the soil. Stick figures with elongated arms, eyes scratched deep into the walls, thousands of them, staring outward in all directions. Watching. A low hum vibrated through the chamber, not electrical, not mechanical, alive. The pines had a heartbeat, and I was inside it. Something shifted behind me. I spun, lantern lifting, a person. But not truly. One of the locals I had seen at the lookout, his skin pale, stretched, eyes vacant, yet searching, mouth trembling as if trying to form words that memory had forgotten how to shape. He lifted a hand and pointed upward, toward the ceiling, toward the forest. Go. It wasn't a threat. It was a warning. I stumbled back up the stairs, slamming the basement door behind me. The thuds on the roof became rapid now, like fists, like claws. The cabin shuddered. They were here. I raised the flare gun, aimed at the door, because if they wanted me, they'd have to come through fire. The door splintered with a single blow. Then, silence. A heavy breath seeped through the cracks before anything else moved. I felt eyes on me, yellow, sharp, hungry. The lantern flickered, shadows jerking like puppets pulled taut by unseen strings. Then something that smelled of frost, rot, and wet fur stepped inside. I fired. The flare burst into blinding red fire, exploding against thick fur. A roar tore through the cabin, so loud the walls quaked. The thing reeled back, howling into the night as flames clung to its chest. I ran. Branches whipped me, tore at my clothes, but I didn't stop. Behind me, the creature bellowed again, this time answered by another in the distance. And another. They were calling to each other, hunting as one. I sprinted until my legs gave out and collapsed beneath a fallen cedar. I lay there gasping, clutching the empty flare gun, listening. Leaves rustled as something huge passed nearby, sniffing the air, searching. I held my breath until white stars danced behind my eyelids. Minutes felt like hours. Finally, silence returned. Not peace, just a pause. I crawled from the tree's shadow and kept moving toward the faintest glow on the horizon. Civilization. A road. Headlights of a ranger truck patrolling. I waved both arms wildly and the vehicle screeched to a stop. Cole jumped out, eyes wide. Where the hell have you been? But his voice sounded distant, like I was listening from underwater. I tried to speak. Only 2 words came out. They're real. He grabbed my shoulders, shaking me. What did you see? I opened my mouth, truth ready to spill like poison, when a stronger instinct twisted through me. Don't speak it, because the senior ranger had been right. Acknowledgement invites attention. Cole scanned the trees nervously. Let's get you out of here. He drove me straight to the station, trying to make sense of my condition. But I wasn't listening. My thoughts stayed behind, in the pines, where glowing eyes still burned through the dark. Hours later, they sent me home on mandatory leave. Trauma, they called it. Suggested counseling. Said the forest can get into your head. They have no idea. Tonight, I'm packing a bag. I've decided to leave this place behind. I'll put these stories away, bury the memories deep. I'll let people believe the disappearances are tragic accidents, nothing more. Because if I scream the truth from the rooftops, it will hear me. And tonight, as I prepare to leave, I swear I can feel it stretching its long shadow across the town. Reaching. Waiting. There are spirits in those pines. Spirits that walk on 2 legs and breathe frost. They speak through voices that never belong to them. They claim what wanders too far, and they do not let go once they find something new to hunger for. Humans aren't meant to feel like prey, but in the pines, we are. So if you ever go wandering where the trees grow thick enough to block the sky, do not stray from the trail. Do not follow footprints that shouldn't exist. Do not answer when the night whispers your name. And if you hear 3 knocks on your cabin wall, don't open the door. You might not survive what waits on the other side. Because this forest, my forest, remembers everyone who leaves and it remembers everyone who tries. But mostly, it remembers those who escape. Even miles away from those towering trees, I can still hear the pines calling like a distant breath, and I know the story isn't finished. It's waiting for me to come back.